was trying to tell him. Around them, the noise and bustle of the camp continued. Garland politely did not meet Ned's eyes as the man stared at him, but he knew that the boy could feel the weight of his gaze. Garland was halfway through his broth, by Ned's reckoning, when Ned realized what the man was trying to tell him. "She will not betray us." Garland inclined his head, eyes fixed on his bowl before he let out a loud sigh and wrenched his eyes around to stare at Ned. "She will have demands." He nodded, having expected that response. It would be necessary to at least offer Lady Olenna something, not because they needed to ensure her silence, but because she had given, and would give, the North much, for little in return. Did Lady Olenna offer any other advice or comment? "Only that when I arrived at Riverrun, I was to send word to her with your answer as to whether you knew, and she would handle the rest." "Prince Oberyn does not know." "No," Garland replied quietly. "I would not tell him. Margaery is in the north and we have as good as declared for the king. If we were to lose Dorne, we may not win this war and I cannot risk my sister so." They fell back into a silence and Ned did his best not to watch Garland as the man turned back to his food. In his effort to not stare, he turned his attention to outside the tent partition and watched the comings and goings of the men as they moved through the encampment. In the distance, if he squinted, he could see his son and Prince Oberyn talking quietly, their heads close together. Nearby, Grey Wind and Ghost circled each other yipping and barking. "You and Prince Oberyn seem friendly," he said eventually. "We traveled together for several weeks," Lord Stark, Garland replied, his voice firm. "It is hard not to become friendly when you are two men marching into the unknown in the midst of a war. But I did not tell him, and I shall not." He nodded. "What will your grandmother wish for?" "Only a fool would try and guess what my grandmother is thinking," came the short reply. Then Garland sighed and rose to his feet, stretching, coming to join Ned in sitting on the small bed and watching the encampment. "She will want blood on the throne, one day." There was a long pause as they both watched Oberyn and then Garland continued, "He is a good man. But he is rash and arrogant. It will get him killed. If he knew, I would like to say it would change nothing, but it would change everything." He nodded. "He lost everything in the rebellion. It is better he does not know. That no one ever knows. Viserys may make a challenge," he said, the words pouring out before he could stop them. "Some may claim that Jon, a bastard, has less of a claim than Viserys. Viserys Targaryen has no dragon and none of the Seven Kingdoms ready to declare for him," Garland murmured. "Even if he did, Jon has the North, Riverlands and Reach, and that will not change. Not now, of that, I can assure you. I will tell Jon tonight. I will take Oberyn for a spar," Garland said quietly. At Ned's politely bemused look he continued, "We do it nightly. He will suspect nothing." "Thank you. ****. It does not prove anything." "No," he agreed, watching his son carefully. "But Lyanna would have had to been dragged to wed, she would only have done it if she wished." He paused and sighed, taking half a step toward Jon before he paused and said, "And there was no need for him to wed her if he did not wish to. Marrying her gained him little, but should it have come out, it would have cost much." Jon did not reply and instead turned away from them to press his head against Winter. They were on the outskirts of the encampment, just Ned, Jon and Robb. Grey Wind and Ghost were nearby, keeping watch and making sure no one approached, whilst the three men huddled around Winter's warmth. "Did you know?" He shook his head and then, realizing Jon could not see him as his forehead was still pressed against Winter's snout, he said, "No." He swallowed the lump that had risen in his throat and tried to speak, but all that came out was a strange half-garbled sound. He cleared his throat again and finally managed to say, "But if I had known, I would have told you." "Lady Olenna may well be lying," Robb said quietly, when Jon did not speak. "For what reason?" he asked. "If she has the proof, then she has much to gain by keeping the knowledge secret. We will be in her debt should we decide not to tell anyone. If she does not have the proof, why would she lie? Her lie would be found out eventually." "You are right," Jon murmured. They settled into an uncomfortable silence. Jon still did not turn to look at them, and when Ned found his gaze turning toward his son's dragon's eyes, he could not help but think she knew precisely what was going on. One white eye fixed on him, unblinking, for several minutes before she eventually, deliberately, closed and then opened it again. Then she withdrew her snout from Jon carefully and then pushed it back against him. I dreamed of this, John said quietly, pulling away from Winter and turning to look at them in the early evening light. When I found out who my mother was, when Uncle Eamon told me, I dreamed of being told they were wed. I had gone from a bastard to a bastard born of rape. And now I find out that they were wed, and all I can think is that I wish they hadn't been. Why? Because the Dornish can never know, he replied, not even turning to look at Robb but keeping his eyes on John. If Prince Oberyn and Prince Doran find out that Lyanna and Rhaegar wed, that Rhaegar potentially put Elia aside and her children died as a result, it could set off another rebellion, John said, turning away from Ned slightly to look at Robb. Imagine if it was Sansa, Robb. Imagine spending 6 and 10 years thinking Sansa and her children had died because her husband kidnapped and raped another woman, and then finding out it was not rape and her husband had set her aside for another woman. That thousands had died for it. That Benjen died alongside Sansa and your niece and nephew, because that is what the Dornish would feel if they knew the truth. You'd have to stay a bastard, forever, Robb murmured. It could cost me this war, Robb, John whispered. By the gods, if I was Oberyn, I cannot begin to imagine what I might do or how I would react. But I am sure of one thing, it would take a better man than me to support my claim if the roles were reversed. I could not do it. You have the numbers. And numbers mean nothing, John said sharply. The first Daeron had the numbers when he tried to take Dorne, and look how that ended. War is not a game, Robb. I will not gamble on your life, the lives of my men and the lives of our sisters and brothers. Robb was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky above them as though he hoped they might provide him with some answers. Eventually, Robb sighed and dragged his gaze back to fix on John and murmured, "So we tell no one." "We tell no one," he agreed. "I'll send a raven to Highgarden as soon as I am able and instruct Lady Olenna to burn the evidence." "She will not do it for naught," Robb murmured. "Margaery said Lady Olenna wished her to be Joffrey's wife once. House Tyrell want the throne." He shared a quick look with John as Robb turned slightly to look toward Ghost and Grey Wind as they ran past. John inclined his head, clearly reading what Ned was not saying, and he felt a slight weight lift from him. "And they shall have it," John replied. "Once I have a son of my own, he shall be betrothed to a great-granddaughter of hers. She may not take that offer. It is the best she shall get." Robb was silent for a moment and then said quietly, "There is another matter we must discuss." John paused midway through a stride toward Winter. "The Lannisters. Prince Oberyn agrees it is a trap. He thinks they will double back when they know we are close. 299 AC, Jon Snow." "He will be fine," father said quietly, appearing next to John and half surprising him. "He is a strong fighter and no fool." He nodded, feeling more confident than when he and Robb had shared similar words hours earlier. "Ride safe, father." Father nodded back, eyes crinkling slightly as he smiled at John, and then he too turned, heading back toward the army that was nearly assembled. He turned slightly as flickering torchlights caught his attention about the corner of his eye and watched as Ghost, Grey Wind, half a dozen Northmen disappeared into the woods to wait out the battle. At the back of the group Lady Catelyn's hair was hidden by a shawl, and she wore men's clothes, but, despite the distance between them and the darkness, he could easily tell her apart, straight-backed, proud and with an air of determination that was easily distinguishable. She paused after the men had disappeared into the woods, and her pale face turned in his direction for one brief moment. The shawl on her head moved slightly, illuminated by the small torch bracket she held aloft, as though she had inclined her head, then she was gone, disappearing into the woods. He stared into the woods for a moment before Winter nudged him back to focus on her. He relaxed slightly as her snout bumped gently against his shoulder. He turned into her embrace, and she turned slightly as well so that he could lean against the side of her jaw, nearly at perfect eye level with her, and press his face against her. A tick throbbed in her jaw in time with his heartbeat, and he smiled. Then he pulled back and ran one gloved hand carefully down the side of her jaw. She let out a small huff of contentment and then took half a step forward to crouch slightly so he could clamber onto her back. Once he was settled, several minutes later, his armor weighing him down and making it harder than usual to get placed on her back, he called, "Svegan." Winter launched into the air with several powerful thrusts of her wings. In the distance, he could hear Grey Wind and Ghost howl loudly, but the noise was cut off as Winter let out a furious roar as she climbed higher and higher into the sky until she was hidden completely by the clouds of the night sky. They soared for a moment, thousands of feet in the air, as below them the mounted units of his army began to trot forward. In the distance, he could just see his unmounted units under the command of his brother and Mage Mormont, illuminated by the odd torch held aloft, heading toward the route that would take them north of Tumblestone to hit the Lannister encampment that his scouts had informed him was there. Underneath him, Winter let loose a low keening noise as though sensing his anxiety. He let go of one spike and rested a hand against her neck and tried to will down his terror. This would be his first true battle. The fight at Harrenhal had not counted, for they had taken the men there by surprise and they had numbered few. This fight, against the full might of 60,000 Lannisters, outnumbered nearly 4-1, was a gamble. A risk. He had argued with Robb and Father long into the night but a few days ago about how to proceed. He knew it would be wise to wait for the Knights of the Vale, at that point, only a few days away and gaining each day, but he also knew that time was not on their side. Why would the Lannister army wait to be attacked when they knew Jon's host was smaller than their own? He certainly wouldn't. In the end, he had overruled their arguments and now he just hoped that he had not made a mistake, that the Knights of the Vale would arrive in time and that their early attack, having half killed their horses and men to get here faster, would do it justice. In the distance, he could see the tall turrets of Riverrun but could only just make out the Lannister encampment thanks to a few smouldering braziers. Underneath him, Winter beat her wings once and propelled herself higher into the night sky. They soared above the clouds, flying hundreds of feet above Riverrun and then toward the Westerlands before they banked sharply and resumed their previous position of remaining steady in the air. The clouds obscured their view completely. He could not tell where his forces were nor whether the Lannister forces had managed to rouse themselves from their slumber yet. He just had to wait for the signals and pray that when that signal came, he made it in time. Under him, Winter let out a low croon, like a mother trying to reassure her child, and he ran a hand down her neck again, feeling her affection spread through their bond in an instant. Her wings flapped steadily for several minutes, and he pressed himself low, so his chest was brushing against the heat from her scales to try and warm himself. He heard it suddenly, dozens of horns announcing the Northern cavalry as it approached the Lannister encampment, and reacted in an instant. Svegon. Winter let loose a loud roar that echoed around them and propelled herself forwards into a sharp dive. He clung to her back, his legs pressed tight against her sharp scales whilst his hands gripped her spikes as he slid back slightly, the sudden movement having propelled him a few inches on her back. They descended hundreds of feet in an instant, Winter's wings tucked in tightly and Jon flat against her back, before Winter spread her wings and eased off into a glide over the tops of the trees to the west of Riverrun. He heard a crack behind them but did not turn, knowing it was her tail skimming the top of a large tree and likely removing some of the tallest branches. Hundreds of feet ahead of them, he could make out the braziers of the Lannister encampment which were now burning brightly. He felt the breath leave his lungs when he realized he could see them. He could see everything in the encampment now that he was below the clouds. He could see the tents, the braziers, makeshift stables for horses, but what he could not see were soldiers. Winter let out a roar of fury as he swore loudly. He turned his head left and right, desperately trying to find the missing soldiers, as Winter beat her wings more forcefully. In the distance he could see the lights of torches that indicated his forces were approaching. He swore again even as underneath him, Winter kept flying toward Riverrun. Then he saw them, on the south side of the Red Fork down in the valley that led to High Heart, tens of thousands of Lannister men. As he watched, they began advancing, archers at the front, cavalry and foot soldiers behind them. Winter let loose a furious roar as he guided her in a turn toward the Lannister forces, praying that his father and Robb would notice her change in direction and realize that something was wrong. He watched, pressed close to Winter as the lines of Lannister soldiers kept walking even as the archers knocked their bows. There was a moment where they stopped moving and then they began again. In the morning light just beginning to break in the distance he saw thousands of arrows illuminated on the sky. Suddenly, Winter jerked her wings and lurched toward the side, and he almost went tumbling as she turned, exposing her heavy scales to the arrows coming toward them. They bounced off her with a gentle tapping noise, and those that did not hit her found their mark in the land between Riverrun and the Lannister forces. Winter righted herself again and he sculled, tightening his legs against her and clinging more tightly to her spikes. The Lannister soldiers paused again and another whooshing noise told him more arrows were approaching. Winter dived to the right and the arrows flew harmlessly past them, burying themselves in the dirt. Behind him he could hear the noise of thousands of horses as their hooves hit the ground in unison, a heavy clatter of their shoes against the road before they veered off to give chase, across the fields, toward Jon and Winter. Winter turned in a large loop, skimming back behind Riverrun and then back toward High Heart, until she was behind his cavalry. She flew steadily, flapping her wings once for every dozen of strides the horses beneath her took. In the distance, the Lannister archers let loose another round of arrows. Shields. He heard someone beneath him roar, but he paid them no mind. Dracarys. White and red flames poured out Winter's mouth as she cut a path through the arrows. He pressed himself flat against her and tucked his head under one arm as the arrows she failed to blast whipped past them. She let loose another roar and he lifted himself slightly. They were closer now. Below them, he heard the neighing of terrified horses and the screams of injured men. For the king. His heart caught slightly, and he heaved a deep breath out as he realized that, for now, father still lived. For the king. He kept his eyes on the Lannister soldiers as the archers brought their bows close to them as they stopped walking and, behind them, the cavalry began to move faster, breaking into a soft trot and then a canter as they darted through the gaps that the archers created for them. They kept in uniform lines, their swords held high as they advanced on Jon's forces. He spared a moment's thought to hope and pray to the old gods that Mage Mormont and Robb had realized why Winter had swooped around Riverrun, that she had been guiding them toward the fight, and then turned his attention back to the Lannister forces, counting down until he could give the order. It came moments later as the archers reached the back of the Lannister formation and the cavalry turned from a canter into a gallop. The archers raised their bows high again, now protected by the advancing cavalry, and the unmounted Lannister men, and let loose their arrows for a third time. The sound of the arrows was lost in the furious roars of his men, the thundering hooves of Lannister horses and the screams of men who had already been hit, but Winter's roar was not. It echoed across the small distance now separating the two armies and he watched with satisfaction as several horses bolted, throwing their riders to the ground where they were trampled by their allies. Winter beat her wings faster, flying past the first rows of his own troops until she was several body lengths ahead. Dracarys. Winter's flames poured out of her mouth, stronger and hotter than before. He ducked his head slightly as she suddenly beat her wings faster, flying through some of her own flames, but kept his eyes open and watched as arrows disappeared to naught but dust. She let out another furious roar and another torrent of fire poured out, fanning across the first few rows of the Lannister cavalry as she moved her head backwards and forwards trying to hit as many as she could. She loosed her flames for a third time and turned tightly as she flew over the first few rows of men and horses. He guided her in a tight turn, off toward the east until she flew over the edge of their forces and then he turned her back just as tightly, keeping his legs pressed to her side. Dracarys. Below them, he watched as burning men stumbled over each other screaming in agony and their allies rode past them toward the northern forces. Again and again, Winter loosed her flames as she flew straight over the first few rows of still advancing cavalry. He glanced down, eyes taking in the charred remains of dead men. His gaze fixed on the first rows of his cavalry as the two armies met with an almighty crash, desperately trying to turn his eyes away from the dying men, the sight of burning men and smell of charring flesh making his stomach turn and his eyes water. He glanced away from the beginning of the fight and watched as, in the distance and illuminated by the rising sun and the lights of Riverrun, flickering lights appeared around the side of the great castle. It took a moment to realize what he was seeing, then he smiled as Winter let out a roar. Robb. 299 AC, Robb Stark. With me. He roared. He longed to run toward the fight but knew that, weighed down with armor as he was, it would be folly. Instead, he and the 5,000 men at his command kept striding as fast as was possible, without exhausting themselves, toward the battle that raged in the distance. Their numbers were small enough that they should not have been missed from a surprise attack, but now, taken by surprise as they had been, his 5,000 men were crucial. He kept his eyes fixed on the battle ahead, barely noticing as the gate of Riverrun was lowered and dozens of men rushed out to join them. They crossed past the abandoned Lannister encampment, and he broke into a jog. Behind him, thousands of men did likewise. As they approached the two armies, now almost fully entangled in each other, he watched as Winter circled above the fighting. Every now and then she let out bursts of flame toward the back of the fighting and he knew Jon must be trying to take out the soldiers that were not already involved in the battle. They're retreating. Oberyn roared. He squinted and realized the man was right. At least 3,000 Lannister men were vanishing into the woods. As he watched, the clouds that had been present began to part slightly and he realized they were archers, vanishing to hide amongst the trees to avoid winter's fury. He turned slightly and knew the men were following him. Only a fool would try and approach mounted units from behind, even if they were allies, given the terror horses experienced in the heat of battle. Instead, his men would approach slightly from the west and try to pin the Lannisters from that side. "Together, men!" he yelled, raising his sword as they drew closer. "Stick together!" In front of them, several dozen still mounted Lannister soldiers began to turn and bandy together, ready to charge them down. He raised his sword higher and gripped it with both hands, ready to meet them. A furious roar ripped through the air, and he flinched back as the advancing cavalry were struck down, vanishing under a torrent of hot dragon fire. Beside him, Oberyn laughed loudly, a vicious, angry sound that set Robb's teeth on edge. They rushed past the burning men, barely paying attention to the flames, and above them Winter let out another furious roar as more and more Lannister soldiers broke away from the fight with Father's troops and advanced toward Robb. Another torrent of white fire flicked with red rushed past Robb, slightly too close to be comfortable, but he paid it no mind. A burning man stumbled toward him, unarmed, and screaming, and he darted to the side and spun, slashing his sword, not even turning to watch the man crumple. He sucked in a deep breath, regretting it instantly as the stench of blood and ash seemed to collect in his mouth. Oberyn darted past him, spear in one hand and a shield in another, and took out two more burning men before Robb had regained his balance from his spin to take out his target. Dead men, still caught by their stirrups, rode past Robb into the men behind him, and he heard someone swore. They were closer to the fighting now, less than several meters to go. Winter let out another burst of flame above them, and with a steady beat of her wings seemed to fan the flame further into the Lannister forces. "For the king!" he roared as he swung his sword wide and high, cutting through one horse and leaving the flailing man in the saddle for whoever was behind him to deal with. Mage rushed past him, half a dozen Mormont men on her heels, and launched herself in the direction of a cluster of unmounted Lannister men. He darted the other way, taking Oberyn and half a dozen Stark men with him, toward the front lines, hoping to clear a path toward where he knew his father would be fighting. Another horse bolted past him, and he threw himself to the side just in time. He scrambled to his feet, lifting his sword to meet the blade of a man seated on horseback. He pushed back, forcing the man's sword away from him, but before he could slice his sword back down, a spear thrust past his ear, straight into the gap in the armor near the man's armpit. Even above the roaring of Winter and the steady noises of the battle, he could hear the man's screams. The spear withdrew and vanished, and Robb leaned forward onto the ball of his feet and shoved his sword up through another chink in the man's armor and turned back to the fighting. Together he and Oberyn along with his men cut a path toward where he hoped to find his father. He could just see Stark banners in the distance. More and more unmounted Lannister soldiers appeared, and around him he watched as his men fell until only he and Oberyn stood alone in their small corner of the battlefield, fighting side by side. "To Lord Robb!" someone roared, but he did not turn. A sword glanced past him, inches from his shoulder, and he took half a step forward and brought his sword down in a wide arch to cleave through the exposed neck of the man who had so foolishly rushed him when he had no helm on. His breath came in short, sharp, painful bursts as he struggled to get air into his body, and his sword arm began to grow heavy, but he pressed on. Another Lannister soldier rushed him. He gritted his teeth and parried the incoming blow, his muscles straining with the effort, but it was not in vain. The man stumbled, unable to stop his momentum, and Robb turned and caught the backs of the man's exposed knees and sent him flying into the dirt. He stood behind the man and grasped his sword in both hands and brought it straight down into the man's armor, knowing, without even looking properly, that this was no landed knight with heavy armor. He turned and threw himself back into the fray. He gritted his teeth and parried another blow, letting the man stumble past him into whatever man held Robb's flank. Around him, the battle waged on, and he watched as Northman and Lannister soldier alike fell. Smoke obscured his vision and he coughed, choking, as the stench of burning bodies grew so powerful that every time he drew breath he thought he might be sick. A sword swung down across his vision, and he raised his own a fraction too late, but it did not matter. Another sword caught the original sword before it could make contact and pushed it back. He watched as Garland Tyrell leaned forward, shoving past Robb and forced the Lannister man back with such force the man stumbled backwards, tripping over his own feet, and fell into the dirt. Robb raised his own sword, ready to deliver the killing blow, but before he could a riderless horse stampeded over the soldier's fallen body in its desperation to escape the battlefield. He flung himself to the side, taking Garland with him, as the horse rushed toward them. They stumbled to their feet together and launched back into the fray. In the distance, he saw Daisy Mormont approach a Lannister man, who was fighting Mage, from behind and swung her Morning Star against the man's head. Half a dozen soldiers rushed toward them, obstructing his view of the Mormont women, and he raised his own sword in response. Next to him Garland launched forward, and he felt someone move in around him. A spear extended past him. Together, he, Oberyn and Garland dispatched the men within moments. Another ear-splitting roar split the air, sending some of the Lannister horses bolting, and Robb used the chaos to cut through two soldiers who had been thrown from their horses. "Forge a path!" he yelled, his voice hoarse and his sentence ending in a hacking cough as smoke filled his lungs. "Forge a path!" Oberyn Martell roared. Around him he heard more men giving the same orders. He forced himself not to look at the advancing soldiers, his sword slashing though Lannister soldier after Lannister soldier as he tried to fight his way closer toward where the bulk of Stark men would be. Another roar split the air and another gust of air sent the smell of burning, charred bodies straight through him, making him want to retch. He gritted his teeth and fought down the bile clawing its way up his throat. He stumbled slightly, his boots losing traction on the sodden, bloody earth, but managed to keep himself upright. He ducked a wild swing only moments later, noticing dimly that whoever had been behind him had not been so lucky, and rose to his feet and stabbed his sword into the side of the Lannister soldier as the man tried in vain to extract his own sword from a dead Northman. He pressed on. Next to him Oberyn let loose a loud roar as a sword slashed him, grazing over his hand, and making the man drop his spear inadvertently. But Robb was there, forcing the Lannister soldier back and, when the moment presented itself, ending the man's life. Oberyn fell back into position and together they pressed on. He was dimly aware of Garland Tyrell barking orders nearby, as though they were his men to give orders to, but also aware of soldiers doing as instructed. He heard it then. "With me, men. With me." The familiarity of the voice hit him like a hammer, and he launched himself forward, batting away swords and cutting through men like they were naught but vapors on the air. Such was the ease of his swing, desperate to get to where his father was fighting. A gust of wind set smoke flying across his vision and he stopped for half a moment, worried he might kill ally instead of enemy, and then pressed on again. Every moment he could spare, he chanced to glance up around the field of battle, taking in the lines and the movements of everything. The Lannister soldiers were beginning to rally again and had begun to slowly encircle them. A furious roar nearby told him that Oberyn had realized what was happening. "Don't let them surround us." Around him, more and more men fell, but he kept pressing on. He couldn't glance up now to look for reinforcements nor to find father, instead he kept pushing. Every Lannister soldier he killed, another two took their place. "They're herding." He flinched as the scream was cut off. "Don't let them surround us." He glanced up, catching sight of father less than a meter away, blood covering his breastplate and ice held high. He turned back instantly, raising his sword to deflect a blow and pushing back against the man. Both fought for a second, desperately trying to find traction on the slick earth before the man skidded, and Robb used the opportunity to plunge his sword through the man's neck. Nearby, Oberyn let out a roar of pure rage and Robb watched as the man's spear spun wildly and he killed two soldiers in seconds. He glanced away again, using the distraction to finish another soldier and grab a Stark shield, desperately trying not to think about what had happened to the original owner. Clegane. Around him, several soldiers paused for a moment, but Robb did not. He kept fighting and only paused when he could safely take a moment. He turned his head quickly, desperately trying to find where Oberyn had gone. A sword swung into field, and he lifted the shield instinctively and, when the man stumbled backwards in surprise and fell to the ground, he slammed the shield down onto the man's breastplate, watching in satisfaction as he crumpled. He put one foot on the dead man's chest and tried to wrench out the shield but could not, so he turned and flung himself back into the battle. Again and again, he raised his sword and again a man died. The smell of smoke and charred bodies clung to him, and he pursed his lips, even though he longed to breathe in deeply, to try and avoid getting the scent on his tongue. He parried a blow, turning slightly to one side as he did so, and his eyes caught on hulking form ahead and two smaller figures darting around him, one with a long spear and one with a sword clad in gold and green. The man Rob was fighting raising his sword, swinging right, and Rob ducked and threw himself at him, sending them both toppling into the dirt. They grappled for a moment before a morning star swung into view and smashed in the man's helm. He did not stop to thank Daisy Mormont and instead turned and launched himself toward where Oberyn and Garlan fought Gregor Clegane. They were better than Rob, with more experience, but he rushed toward them regardless. As he drew closer, he watched as Clegane raised his sword and swung it down toward where Garlan stood, but the Tyrell threw himself to the side and Clegane's sword was buried in the earth. He roared in fury as Clegane managed to extract his sword before Garlan had risen to his feet, but he needn't have, for Oberyn was there, shoving his spear toward Clegane's neck and making the man let out his own angry roar as he stumbled back. Clegane raised his sword as though to swing it widely and cleave Oberyn in two, but the other man ducked and dived to one side. Then Rob was there, meeting Clegane's second swing whilst Oberyn rolled away. He felt the reverberation of the two swords meeting echo down his arm and clenched his hand around the pommel of his own sword, lest he drop it. Clegane roared in fury and wrenched his arm back with surprising speed, making Rob lose his balance slightly, and he flailed for a moment before he jumped backwards as Clegane's sword swung across the space where Rob had been moments before. Oberyn was there again, swinging his spear intricately, distracting Clegane for a moment. Rob leaped forwards, slashing wildly and managing to glance his sword across Clegane's arm, not deeply enough to do significant damage but enough that the chainmail gave way and his sword met flesh. He flung himself backwards just in time as Clegane turned on him with a furious roar. He lifted his own sword to deflect the blow, but another sword cut across and Garlan parried the swing from Clegane just as Oberyn launched himself at the man's now exposed back. There was a brief pause and then Clegane's helm went flying, spinning wildly off into the battlefield. Oberyn moved slightly, leaning forwards and went to thrust his spear again. Clegane roared in anger again and turned toward Oberyn, forgetting Garlan and Rob. The Dornishman, momentarily surprised, was caught off guard and went stumbling back, but Rob was already there, jabbing his sword at the back of Clegane's neck even as the other man kept advancing toward Oberyn. Rob's sword glanced off the high plate protecting the back of the man's neck, but, next to him, Garlan's sword did not. As Rob's sword wrenched sideways, Garlan's met flesh. He watched, gasping for breath, as Garlan's sword swung clean through the middle of Clegane's head. There was a brief pause as what remained of Clegane collapsed and then a sword swung into his vision. He raised his own instinctively and parried the blow. "Don't let them form up." The man he was fighting glanced up and Rob used the moment to slice through him. Then he glanced up and took sight of the battlefield. The Lannisters had begun to encircle them, and the archers were moving back toward the army, readying to loise their arrows. He swore, realizing what they were planning. Above him, Winter let out a furious roar. A breeze swept past him as Jon's dragon flew only a few meters above his head and let out short bursts of flame, trying to create gaps in the Lannister forces so the archers could not loose their arrows. "Crazy fucker will kill his own men," someone roared. He found himself on the front line, fighting side by side with Daisy Mormont as a cluster of Lannister soldiers advanced on them. He chanced a glance at Daisy as she spun away from her latest fight and flinched when he caught sight of the nasty gash on her thigh, dripping blood steadily down her leg, and the slightly bleary-eyed expression she wore. "Leave her to me," a voice roared nearby. He flinched at the booming roar from Great Yonumber but was already turning before the man had finished scooping Daisy toward him and begun forging a path back through the clustered Stark soldiers. Another roar split the air and he changed a glance up in time to see Winter let out a blast of flames that sailed straight over his head toward the approaching Lannister forces. "She's tiring," someone yelled. As he watched, Winter lurched to one side and dropped a few feet. His heart caught in his chest as he watched Jon guide her away from the battlefield. Then he turned away as instead of his eyes being covered by Winter's shadow, he faced the bright morning sun, nearly fully risen now, and was momentarily blinded. "Keep pushing," he roared, watching as a Riverland soldier leapt past and intercepted a spear heading toward him. They pushed forward again. His sword rose and fell. Yet they kept coming. The ground under his feet was slick and he stumbled repeatedly as he tried to fight his way past fallen allies and Lannister soldiers alike. His feet squelched unpleasantly as sodden earth and congealed blood began to be kicked up by the two armies and found their way into his boots. Sweat poured down his face and his sword arm began to grow slacker with each swing taking a greater effort than the last. Nearby he watched as Ricard Carstark, with a blazing white sunburst on black on his cloak, fell, and as a Lannister soldier stood victorious over him. Nearby he could hear Garlan and Oberyn bellowing orders and every now and then a burst of laughter from the fierce Dornishmen. Somewhere in the distance, Father was roaring his own orders. A sudden movement to his right drew his attention and he raised his own sword instinctively and deflected the incoming blow with great effort. Yet, his opponent was as exhausted as Robb felt and he was able to dispatch the man quickly. He chanced another glance up and watched as Jon led Winter in a wide sweep away from the field of the battle. Then his eyes lit on something in the distance, a banner fluttering in the wind. He squinted, unable to recognize the sigil for a moment, and then he felt a smile break out across his face as he finally placed the yellow burning tower. The Knights of the Vale. Around him, men dispatched their opponents, and he knew that one by one they were beginning to turn toward the northeast where hundreds of figures were pouring over the crest of the hill that the Northern and Riverlands troops had crossed hours before. In the sky, Winter flapped her wings more fervently, flying toward the approaching forces. There was a short pause and then a high-pitched roar, only just discernible over the clash of steel and roars of men, echoed out across the space between the advancing knights and the raging battle. It was small, barely the size of a foal, and its scales blended perfectly with the bronze banners of House Royce that were beginning to charge down the hill making it hard to see, but it was a dragon. Dragon! Someone screamed in terror. Now men! He roared, tearing his eyes away from the rider at the front of the advancing forces, the rider whose silver hair was streaming out from under his helm and who could only be one person, and back toward the Lannister forces, still half frozen as they stared at the thousands of fresh troops racing toward them. 299 AC, Jon Snow. He could feel Winter's fatigue through their bond as she desperately tried to keep her flames hot enough to do damage to the Lannister troops. Only dozens of feet below he could hear Robb and Father barking orders at their troops, ordering them not to let the Lannisters surround them. He cast a quick prayer to the old gods, hoping that they could manage until the Knights of the Vale arrived, and cursed again as his naivety and foolishness in hoping that the Lannister forces would be taken as easily unawares as those who had garrisoned Harrenhal would be. It was not a battle he had expected. He knew war to be a bloody and vicious thing where some men found glory but more often than not, they just found death. But this was worse. He knew that given half a chance, and the moment that enough Lannister soldiers were away from the bulk of the fighting that he could get away with it, that Tywin Lannister would order his archers to fire on the northern troops and accept the loss of any Lannister soldiers who hadn't managed to clear the fighting. All he could do was try and stop that from happening. His eyes swept across the battlefield again and he watched with dread gnawing at him as slowly the Lannister troops began to encircle his forces. Beneath him, he could feel Winter trembling, the beats of her wings slowing, and hear her heavy breathing as she struggled to maintain altitude. Tegon, he murmured, running a hand down her side, knowing that she would feel his desire even if she could not hear him. Annoyance raced through her to him, and he hastily grasped her spikes again as she let out another roar of rage. She turned sharply and headed off in a loop around the battlefield, blasting gaggles of Lannister soldiers with her flames as she did so. The Knights of the Vale. Winter reacted before he did, her body launching to one side and heading toward the oncoming army. Relief poured through their bond, and she let out a furious roar, half lost in the chaos and noise of the battlefield below them, and then it vanished. There was a moment where they both locked their eyes on the same sight, the small bronze and green dragon, flying high above the Knights of the Vale, and then the emptiness of the bond between them was replaced with incandescent joy. He guided her in a wide circle, looping behind the Knights of the Vale and then back over them until they were flying high above the smaller dragon and the man, out at the front, easily a dozen feet ahead of the rest of the forces, with silver hair. For the king! Someone yelled beneath him. There was a momentary pause and then another voice, a voice with a lilt of High Valyrian, just like Aemon's, that he had waited moons to hear roared, "For the king! For House Targaryen!" In the distance, he watched as the Lannister archers began to stride forward, knocking their arrows and raising their bows. He swore and let Winter guide him away from the incoming arrows, praying that his uncle would be safe as he did so. Winter let out another roar, this one tinged with joy and fury, and looped around to the edge of the battlefield. The fatigue she had seemed to be feeling mere minutes before had vanished and, without him prompting, she let out bursts of flames setting alight several dozen Lannister soldiers. The flames were weaker than they had been hours before, but still strong enough that those who she caught stood no chance. He grimaced as the stench of charred flesh washed over him as Winter beat her wings. Above the noise of the battle, he heard Viserys' voice call out again, "For House Targaryen." He glanced over, watching as the Lannister soldiers near to where Viserys and the Knights of the Vale would smash into the battle finishing forming up with their shields raised. He felt Winter pause slightly, her wings still beating to keep them aloft, as she too watched the little green and bronze dragon. There was another high-pitched shriek and then flames roared out of the little dragon's mouth, enveloping at least half a dozen soldiers and making several dozen more flinch noticeably away to pave the way for Viserys and those behind him to smash through the front lines. Through their bond, he felt satisfaction tinged with pride pour from Winter as she turned her attention away from the smaller dragon and back to the battle. Together, he and Winter continued to try and pick off groups of Lannister soldiers, wary of accidentally catching his own men or, even worse, enabling the Lannister soldiers to bunch together and give Tywin the opportunity to send more arrows into the battle. It was slow work and every time he looked up from the latest group that had burned it felt like they were making no progress. He listened to the yelling below, from Viserys and his father, and desperately tried to help as much as he could. He could feel Winter tiring again and, after the second time in but a few moments that she dropped, he finally felt her acceptance through the bond that they would need to land. She was not yet strong enough to stay airborne with his weight on her for so long. They landed heavily on the edge of the battlefield, and he dismounted her quickly, sliding off the side of her and not even turning to look at her as he raised his sword and sprinted into the battlefield. Winter let out a roar and launched herself back into the air. As he ran, soldiers on the edge of the battlefield began to fall in beside him until dozens of them had formed a tight group, as though to protect him, as he launched himself into the fray. In the distance he caught sight of his uncle. Viserys still had his helm on, but his silver hair and the presence of his dragon but a few meters above his head gave him away. "Toward my uncle!" he roared, knowing that only those nearby would hear him about the din of the battle. They obeyed and together he and the soldiers cut a path toward Viserys. It was hard work. The ground was sodden with blood, fluids and mud and several times he stumbled as his feet caught on burned remains or broken shields and swords. Winter swooped over them, casting them into shadow, and he took advantage of the fear that flashed over the faces of the nearby Lannister soldiers to split one in two before he moved on to another. A high-pitched scream ripped through the air and he looked up for half a second, taking his eyes off his opponent, to watch as the little bronze and green dragon set a man alight. Out of the corner of his eye he saw his neglected opponent raise his sword high, as though to bring it down on Jon's head, and he raised Dark Sister in the nick of time. The blade glanced off his own, sliding along to the pommel, and he felt himself grin sharply, remember a similar maneuver what felt like years ago, and pushed back using the motion to slice the man's throat with his own blade. With Prince Viserys. He turned, letting the man he had killed drop to the ground, and turned toward Mage Mormont's voice. "For the king." Around him, his men seemed to realize where he wanted to go and together they beat a path toward where his uncle, Mage Mormont and the bulk of the Knights of the Vale were fighting. As he fought, he kept half an eye on his uncle, unable and unwilling to look away. Viserys' form was not the best Jon had seen, he was clearly no natural with a sword, but he made up for it with his speed and grace. As Jon watched, Viserys pulled a fleeing Lannister soldier back with one hand until the man was pressed up against Viserys' chest. His uncle's arm pulled tight across the man's lower jaw, tipping the man's head up and exposing his neck, and then he sliced his sword across the man's throat, pushing him aside and launching his next attack without another look. He darted to the side, just in time to avoid a glancing blow to the hip, and then ducked. He rose again, raising his sword, but the man was already falling to the ground. He spun again, turning his attention back to Viserys, now without a helm, who was only feet away, even as more of his own men closed in around him. Viserys ducked a blow, spinning as gracefully as Jon had seen Oberyn do during his evening spars with Garland Tyrell, and rose again. He watched as his uncle lunged forward and shoved his sword straight into the other man's face, hard enough that his sword went through the man's skull with ease, and they two men toppled into the dirt. He glanced away, looking toward the approaching ranks of the Lannister soldiers as they began to recalibrate and form ranks. "Don't let them form up," he roared. Feet away, Viserys turned and looked at him. His breath caught in his chest. His uncle was gaunt, far too thin to be healthy, but there was a determination to the set of his jaw and a slight softening to the edge of his cheeks that told him his uncle was heading back toward being healthy rather than heading toward starvation. He was pale, nearly as pale as Jon, and although his cheeks were flushed with exertion, he looked sickly. But it was Viserys' eyes that made him pause, eyes that he would recognize anywhere. Aemon's eyes. The same shape, the same color, the same brightness and the same ferocity that Jon had seen so many times. Then Viserys turned away. A hand touched his shoulder and he spun instinctively, raising his sword, before he realized that no one would touch him in the heat of battle if they did not know him. His eyes met Grey and then he turned back around and launched himself back into battle with father behind him. His sword rose and fell repeatedly. Blood caked his breastplate and sweat dripped into his eyes and all he could smell was death, blood and shit. He sucked in a deep breath, grimacing at the taste on his tongue, and darted after a soldier who had turned and was fleeing the battlefield. He dragged the man back with one arm and slashed Dark Sister across the man's throat and then let the body to the floor. A shadow passed overhead and he glanced up to watch as Winter and the small dragon flew past. Suddenly rage roared through him. He turned his eyes away from Winter to look around him and watched as in the distance, the Lannister forces began to raise their bows, Tywin clearly having now decided to either aim for the dragons or that the troops under Jon's commands had bunched enough he could risk killing some of his own men to dispose of Jon's forces. No. Viserys' voice cut through him to the bone, but he did not turn. Instead, he kept his eyes on Winter and the other dragon and watched as Winter beat her wings twice, making it look easy, but he could feel how much effort it took her through their bond, and elevated herself over the top of the smaller dragon. A long blast of fire came out of her mouth and the arrows that did not hit her, and bounce uselessly to the ground, were incinerated. Rage poured through their bond again and he watched as the two dragons headed toward the archers. He followed their progress, turning slightly and meeting the eyes of his uncle as he did so. He titled his head and spun away raising his sword. Form up. He half expected father to slot into the space next to him, but for a moment no one did. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw his uncle slot into formation next to him. They launched forward together. It was more chaotic than before, the Lannisters were the ones surrounded now. The Knights of the Vale had broken through their ranks and, although they were clearly nearly as exhausted as the Lannister soldiers and the northern troops, their arms were fresh, and their aim was true. Not enough of the Lannister soldiers remained mounted now, most had either lost their horses, or their horses had collapsed with fatigue. We have the advantage. Push them back. He roared. He parried a blow from a man in Westerling colors and was about to impale the man with a thrust through the chest when another sword beat him to it. He glanced up, meeting his father's eyes. Father nodded once then jerked his head towards a cluster of Westerling men who had momentarily frozen, already raising his sword. Jon nodded back and together they leapt toward the Westerling man who made to scatter. He dodged a blow, leaping to the side, and raised his sword to counter another attack. The man who had swung his sword, expecting Jon to be unbalanced on the slick ground, stumbled back in surprise. Grim satisfaction slid through him as a sword speared the man through the gut and then was unceremoniously yanked back. When the man had fallen to the ground, his eyes met Robb's. The noise of the battle was overwhelming now, gone were the victorious roars from the Lannisters. Instead, all he could hear was screaming and crying. In the distance, he could see men fleeing. His chest heaved as he cleaved another man in two, splitting him from stem to stern. Out of the corner of his eye he watched as a Lannister man, tall with a great lion carved on his breastplate and golden hair that was curled with sweat and clung to the man's neck, approached Viserys from behind, even as his uncle and Robb beat back more Westerling men. He moved on instinct, his sword raised to intercept the blow that was aiming for his uncle's back. He got there just in time and Jaime Lannister's sword hit his own with such force that he felt the reverberation down his arm even though he could not hear the noise of the two swords meeting over the din of the battle. He took half a step backward to brace himself and pushed back, watching for half a second as the sword slid down the blade Dark Sister, and then gathered all his strength and shoved his full weight toward the other man. It was Jaime Lannister's turn to stumble back this time. His sword slid against Dark Sister's blade, but he rallied quickly and pulled his sword blade free from where it had come to rest the pommel, inches from Jon's face. The man swung widely and with his full force, angling his hips as he did so to get enough momentum to take Jon's head cleanly off. No! He heard someone roar. He ducked, flinging himself to the side, and felt the sword sweep inches over his head. He rose quickly, scrambling to his feet, and raised his sword to deflect another blow. He was a fraction slower than Jaime Lannister, but not so slow that it made a difference. His sword raised in time, and he parried the blow with ease. They parted and went at each other again and again. He took a chance and lunged forward, putting a bit too much weight into it, but his opponent ducked and weaved, and so all Jon managed was to clip the Kingslayer's shoulder. The man flinched at the blow but raised his own sword again. Jon skittered backwards, picking up a broken Lannister shield as he did so. Again and again, they met. As his sword arm grew tired, Jon began to rely more and more on the shield he carried to try and deflect the blows. He was dimly aware of Lannister soldiers grouping around them, trying to hold back Jon's men from coming to his aid. Through their bond he could feel Winter's concern and fury, as she too was rendered useless. His armor was weighing him down and his breathing was heavy, each gasp of air more painful than the last. He adjusted his grip on Dark Sister as the Kingslayer lunged again, swinging his sword in a wide arc that Jon dodged. But he was not fast enough to dodge the rebound blow, Jaime Lannister moving with such speed that he managed to clip Jon on the arm, making him drop the sword, before Jon had fully realized what had happened. He darted backwards and tightened his grip on his shield as Jaime Lannister raised his sword high again. Then, suddenly, there was a flash of bright, brilliant flame. Jaime Lannister dropped his sword with a scream as his outstretched arm was engulfed in dragon flames. It burned bright for a moment before vanishing as though the dragon that sent the fire did not have the energy to keep its flames going. But the damage was done. There was a moment of silence and then an arm wrapped around Jaime Lannister's neck and yanked his helm back and off his head. It dropped to the blood-soaked, sodden earth with a dull thunk. Dimly, Jon was aware that there was nearly silence over the battlefield, as though it were over. He could still hear screams of dying men and the neighing and screaming of terrified horses, but the sound of steel on steel was beginning to fade. He turned his attention back to Jaime Lannister. Behind him, Viserys pulled the man closer to him. His own face was caked in blood and mud, there was a cut on his forehead bleeding profusely, and his mouth was set in a vicious snarl as he tilted Jaime Lannister's head back. His blade pressed against the Kingslayer's throat. "Tell your men to stand down." Interlude, 298 AC, Aemon Targaryen. "You have decided then?" "I have no choice. I will leave on the morrow," Jon replied quietly. There was a pregnant pause and then he said, "Do you have any last advice for me before I fly south, uncle?" He paused considering his nephew's words carefully. Then he sighed. "When you are king, they will ask much of you, nephew. They will ask you to let men die. They will ask you to let men live. They will ask you to start wars and to end wars, to let people starve and to let people feast, to support the Seven and to support the old gods, to pray and be humble and to kill and be proud. They will ask everything of you, and they will give you little in return. You will need to trust in yourself and others to know which path to take for the good of the realm. You make it sound like there is no pleasure to be found in ruling." "There is not," he replied frankly. He leaned forward and stabbed the crackling logs in the fireplace with the poker and then leaned back again. He nodded in satisfaction as the flames sparked a bit more strongly and turned to head back to his bed, taking his spot under the covers. "Ruling is very different to being a lord or even a lord paramount." "I know that." "You do not." Jon scowled at him, and he smiled back at his nephew. "You think that Ned Stark is evidence of what it takes to be a lord paramount? I can assure you, he is not," he continued, watching his nephew carefully. "Ned Stark, as good a man as he may be, he is only a lord paramount. And, as Benjen and the Lord Commander are fond of reminding me, the North is different." "You've said it is different in the South, I understand." "You do not," he snapped, his voice sharper this time. In front of him, on the chair by his desk, Jon turned red and scowled at him, but did not move and instead leaned forward, ready to listen to what Aemon was to say. "You do not," he said more gently. "Your whole life from the moment you claim the throne, until the moment you die, will be about survival. Then why did you wish for me to take it?" "It is not that I wished for you to take the throne," he said carefully, his voice softer now, afraid to upset his nephew again. It is that I did not wish you to die here. That winter hatched for you, it left you with no choice. If I truly thought you could be safe and happy without the Iron Throne and with House Lannister on the throne, I would counsel against war." There was a long pause whilst he and Jon looked at each other. Eventually, Jon inclined his head once and then glanced away toward the fire. "What if I cannot give the lords and ladies what they want?" "You must find yourself allies." "I have allies." "Not enough," he murmured. "You have the Riverlands, possibly, through your father's marriage to Lady Catelyn. You have the Reach through your brother's marriage to Margaery Tyrell. But the support of a Lord Paramount does not give you the whole kingdom. You must surround yourself with men and women who have influence. Through marriage and the small council. And through bonds formed elsewhere, on the field of battle, for example. There are men who will respect you more for your skill on the battlefield than they will for your skill in ruling. There are men who will respect you more if you care for the small folk and men who will respect you more if you do not. I am not ready." "You will never be ready," he replied mildly. "Yet, I have given you all the advice you need to not only survive but thrive. You must remember, nephew, that no matter how many people love you that there will be those who do not. Your enemy today could be your greatest ally tomorrow and your greatest ally today might turn on you in the blink of an eye. Trust in your family, in Stark and Targaryen, and take counsel from those who are wiser, older and more knowledgeable than you. The art of being a good king is knowing not to not rely on yourself. What if I am counseled to do something I cannot bring myself to do, if it is right for the realm? Then you are not fit to be king." Chapter 28, Pity. Chapter text. Chapter summary, Jon and Robb get to know Oren and Viserys in different ways. In the interlude, Aemon cautions Jon. Notes, a less action-packed chapter before we return to Stannis/Dany/Theon in the next chapter. Enjoy. 299 AC Jon Snow. Gregor Clegane was dead. Jaime Lannister was in chains. Tywin Lannister had fled with dozens of Riverlands men and Oberyn Martell on his heels. Yet, still Jon could not help but feel as though he was waiting for bad news, for something to make the day worse. They had lost men. Thousands of men, many of whom Jon had liked and laughed with, and lots that he had grown up alongside at Winterfell. That was the price of war, and they had known it, and they had ridden for him regardless, and he understood that. But still, despite the deaths and the fact that he and Father and Robb had managed to get through the fight barely scathed, he could not help but think something was going to happen. It was hours after the battle finished before he finally had a moment to himself to take a breath. He had managed to find some fresh water, a quick bite of food, and removed the armor he had been wearing, but otherwise he had yet to do much else other than the post-battle routine. He tried to avoid moving too quickly or lifting his arms too high, for, not only could he smell himself quite strongly, his muscles ached and burned. Both of those issues were things that could wait. In the distance, up near the Red Fork, he could see the preparations were well underway for the burning of bodies later that day, or more likely on the morrow given the number of dead. Nearby, men were being tended to, and on the edge of the battlefield far down to the south near the trees he could see the outline of Winter. He shifted slightly as he ripped his eyes away from her and turned his attention toward Riverrun. He had not yet spoken to Edmure Tully. He had caught the man's eye several times as he had first greeted Robb, Father, and then Lady Catelyn when she had been told it was safe to come out from where they had been sent, deep into the forest. He knew he would need to speak to Lord Edmure soon and Lord Hoster as well, but they were also not his concern, not yet at least. Father and Robb could handle them for now and make their apologies for the slow progress of the northern forces and the long siege the Tullys had endured, even though the delay had meant they were able to liberate the castle rather than risk ending the war prematurely in Tywin Lannister's favor. "Your Grace." He turned, swiping his sweat-drenched hair out of his eyes as he did so, and faced the man who had so carefully snuck up behind him. He cast his eyes over the man's clothes and then up to the man's face. He was broad-shouldered and with white gold hair. If it had not been for the silver seahorse sigil he wore proudly on his chest, which made Jon's chest ache slightly, that Lord Valerian clearly valued his brother so that he would let the bastard bear his sigil proudly, and the fact that there was no dragon with him, he could have perhaps mistaken the man for a Targaryen. "Lord Oren," he greeted. Oren Water's eyes widened in surprise, as though he could not quite believe that Jon had known who he was or that Jon had greeted him so politely, before he began to lean forward into a bow. He thrust out his arm and grasped the man on his shoulder, stopping his descent. "You need not kneel to pledge your family's loyalty, Lord Oren," he said softly. "I have no doubts as to the loyalty of House Valerian." Oren Waters looked up at him and then slowly rose to his feet. Their eyes met for a moment and then the other man inclined his head. "My thanks, Your Grace." He nodded, grateful that the other man had understood what he had not said. "It is I who should be thanking you, is it not? Everything House Targaryen asked of House Valerian you have done, even when we asked much for so little in return." Oren Waters flushed slightly before he galvanized himself and smiled broadly at Jon. "The old, the true, the brave." He agreed. "I have asked that a room be prepared for you in Riverrun. My brother will escort you and see you fed and bathed. I must speak to my uncle, and then to Lord Tully, but after I hope we might talk." The other man nodded at him and made to turn around, then paused and turned back to Jon. "Your uncle is with your dragon," Oren Waters said, his voice dropping slightly and his tone changing as though he were trying to give Jon a warning. There was a brief pause as he gazed around, as though checking they were not being listened to, before he said in a soft, pleading voice, "Listen to what he has to say, Your Grace." He raised an eyebrow but nodded. He had expected this, for Aemon had warned him that his reunion with Viserys and Daenerys might not be a reunion he would have hoped for. He gestured toward where his brother and father stood nearby, and he watched the retreating form of Oren Waters for a moment. Then he turned his attention back to Winter's outline in the distance and made his way across the battlefield. As he walked, Ghost appeared from the west and fell into pace beside him. He rested one hand on the scruff of his friend's neck as they walked together and felt himself begin to relax slightly. It was slow going. Although he had passed many of the injured men before, some of whom were still waiting for someone to ease their pain, he still stopped to talk to them, whether they be Northmen, Riverlands men or Lannister soldiers. He could not bring himself to stride by them and ignore their plight. He paid particular attention to the men that had experienced Winter's wrath, despite the anguish it caused him and the fervent desire to be sick every time he saw their burns. Eventually, just as the sun was beginning to set in the distance, he found his uncle where Oren Waters had said he would be. Viserys was sat alone at the edge of the battlefield, sword discarded several meters away and eyes fixed unblinkingly on the two dragons that lay entwined together. He was caked in dirt and debris and his silvery hair was nearly brown with mud and grit as though he had sunk his head into a pile of ash. Viserys did not seem to notice him at first, and so Jon cleared his throat and then threw himself down onto the grassy bank next to his uncle, mindful to keep some distance between them. As he did so, Winter lifted her head and let out a trill of happiness before she dropped it again and nuzzled back down to the small dragon that was curled up in a tight ball next to her stomach. Ghost paused for a moment, watching the two dragons carefully, then Winter jostled slightly, moving her neck further away from the small dragon and creating space for Ghost to join them. The smaller dragon raised its own head and regarded Ghost for a moment before it glanced up to Winter and, as though sensing she seemed unconcerned, dropped its head again and closed its eyes. Ghost slinked over to them and settled down, side pressed firmly against Winter's neck and closed his own eyes. Jon watched them in silence, mindful that his uncle was still not looking at him. "She is magnificent," Viserys said eventually, his eyes not leaving Winter. "He is yours as well." As I am theirs," he murmured, eyes moving from Winter to Ghost and feeling the usual warmth flood through him as he looked at his friend. "All the Stark children have one." He paused for a moment and then said quietly, in a tone that he hoped did not sound patronizing, "Your dragon is magnificent as well. That he trusts you so much that he will sleep so fully around people he does not know after what I assume is his first battle is remarkable." "Aerion," Viserys murmured. "I named him Aerion." "Winter." Viserys choked out a noise between a laugh and a sob. Out of the corner of his eye, Jon watched as Viserys' shoulder lifted as he raised his arm, and he swiped his wrist across his face. He turned away slightly from the scene in front of him to look more carefully at his uncle's side profile. He looked thinner than he had on the battlefield, as though now the fight had gone, he was just a man again, and weak. Older than he should have given. He was but a few name days older than Jon, and tired. When was she hatched? Just under a year ago. She was not alive when Rhaegar fell. Viserys' lip quirked upward slightly and then fell again. "You understood. It is a question that I would have asked you if our positions were reversed. She has grown quickly." He took the opening that his uncle gave him with glee, unable to squash the hope inside him that his fears would be for naught. Aemon Targaryen is at the wall. She came from the egg that was placed in his crib when he was born. When he gave up his claim to the throne and chose the life of a maester, and when he went to the wall, her egg went with him. There she waited, in a hole in the wall, for decades. When I arrived, he realized who I was, and gave her egg to me in the hopes that the egg might persuade me not to take the black. She hatched but 2 days later, he said quietly. He paused and turned his attention back to Winter. Our best guess is that being at the wall, which legend says was built with magic as long as she was, accelerated her growth. You believe she absorbed the magic from the wall, as the blue lizards of Essos absorbed the yolk from their egg? I do not know of blue lizards, but yes, that is what we believe happened. He heard Viserys shift slightly and turned his head to watch his uncle. Viserys had leaned forward and was looking at Winter with renewed interest, now more of a spark and alertness to him than Jon had seen when he had first sat down. I am glad, Viserys said quietly, his voice hitching at the end. I am glad. So glad. There was a pause and then the sound of his uncle inhaling, as though to squash the emotions inside him and force his desire to cry back down. It was a move that Jon knew all too well, one he had done dozens of times as a child. I wish she had hatched for Aemon as well, he murmured softly. If she had hatched for him, then everything would be different, Viserys finished. Yes. Daenerys is safe, Viserys said suddenly, his voice stronger and the hint of melancholy before vanishing in an instant. Her son, Rhaego, likewise. Good, he replied softly, deliberately not commenting on the inflection in Viserys' voice nor the opportunity to change the subject to Daenerys and her apparent son. Will you tell me of your journey? Viserys froze next to him and then seemed to collapse in on himself, as though he was suddenly exhausted. Jon waited patiently for Viserys to speak, but as the minutes slipped by and the sun moved further down behind the hills in the distance, he realized that his uncle would not speak. He licked his lips, wondering whether he should break the silence between them, and turned his attention back to Ghost, Winter and the little dragon next to them. Aerion opened his eyes, as though sensing Jon's gaze, and then turned his attention to Viserys and let out a gentle croon. Steeling himself and casting a quick prayer to the old gods that he had not misunderstood his uncle's silence, Jon began to speak. Aemon told me of his brother, Aerion. Bright flame, Viserys murmured quietly, still not raising his gaze from where his eyes remained locked on the ground. Aemon once said there was not a man he loved more, nor felt more pity for, than Aerion, Jon said eventually, his eyes not turning away from the two dragons. He said Aerion was cruel and unkind, that his brother did things that shocked and repulsed him. He said his brother was a monster. He paused and glanced toward Viserys, who was resolutely not looking at him, and sighed. But he still loved him despite the terrible things that his brother did. He was still his brother, his blood. I do not know what you have done that brings you so much shame, uncle, but you are a Targaryen, my family, my blood. I will not cast you aside. Viserys' eyes flashed up to meet his, anger burning brightly in them. On the ground nearby, the little dragon let out an angry squawk before Winter snarled slightly and it fell silent. I sold my sister to a Dothraki. I let him rape her. I threatened to let his whole Khalasar rape her and their horses too if it got me home and the Iron Throne, Viserys hissed, his voice almost quivering in anger. And I would have done it. And yet you are here, he replied softly. And on the battlefield, you guarded my back when you could easily have killed me. He paused, and said quietly, you and Aerion saved my life. The battle was nearly over, and you could have let the Kingslayer finish me. The throne would have been yours by rights and you would have had the support necessary to take it, but you did not. The fight evaporated from Viserys as quickly as it had appeared. Winter let out a long, low croon and the little dragon followed her, and their cries mingled together in a beautiful melody for a few moments. Viserys' arm swiped across his face again and Jon turned away for a moment to give him uncle privacy. They know it too, he said gently. Dragons are not vicious, mindless beasts. They know what you did. Winter would not let you near me if she judged you to be a danger. Ghost is similarly intelligent. He paused and then continued, they trust you, and so do I. There was another strange noise like before, as Viserys clearly fought down some emotion, but his uncle did not speak, and they fell back into silence. The sun was nearly completely set in the sky now, and it was only the still softly burning fires from the battlefield that stopped Jon and Viserys being plunged into darkness. Even once the sun had set and the area around them was bathed in darkness other than the small fires nearby, Viserys did not speak nor move. Jon watched the dragons as they slept and kept half an eye toward his uncle, watching as Viserys opened and closed his mouth several times. At one point, Viserys drew his legs up toward his chest and wrapped his arms around them tightly as though to hold himself together. Eventually, Ghost rose from where he had been sleeping and let out a languid stretch. Then his direwolf trotted over to them and threw himself down on the ground between him and his uncle, let out a yawn that seemed to nearly split his jaw in two, and dropped his head back onto his huge paws and went back to sleep. Jon lifted his hand absently and threaded it through Ghost's fur, basking in the warmth his friend provided them. On Ghost's other side, Viserys shifted slightly, and out of the corner of his eye Jon watched as Viserys very cautiously unlocked his arms from around his legs. There was a brief pause, and then one of his hands moved to rest on Ghost's back before he too threaded his hand tightly into the direwolf's fur. His uncle was half frozen in fear, or terror, for a moment, as though expecting Ghost to turn and snap at him before he relaxed infinitesimally. Eventually, Viserys began to speak quietly. As he spoke, his voice rose and fell as though he were reliving the moments he was telling Jon about. As his uncle continued speaking, Jon turned to look at him. He watched as Viserys squeezed his eyes tight shut as he recalled the death of Rolla, and as Viserys turned away from Jon's gaze toward the south when he spoke of the years after that. His voice turned fond as he referenced Willem Dare and then sad again when he spoke of the man's death and how the servants had stolen from them and how they had been forced, eventually, to sell Rolla's crown. Viserys fell silent then. "It was all you had left of her," he said quietly. "I cannot imagine the pain it caused you." Viserys choked out a dark sob, turning back toward Jon and his eyes lingering on Winter. "I had sold the last part of her I had left. I could barely stand to look at Dany after it. I hated her so much. I spent days weighing up whether to sell the crown or to sell Dany. I have never told her that, but she knows. What sort of brother does that make me?" "You were a child," he murmured. "Just a child, uncle." Viserys did not speak for a moment and instead made the same choked noise he had earlier. Then he started speaking again. He spoke of the time he and Dany had spent on the streets, the abuse he had leveled at his sister and how much he had hated her. He spoke of moving to the manse in Pentos, of Magister Illyrio and of all that came next, Khal Drogo, the arrival of Oren Waters, the injury Khal Drogo endured, his death, Dany nearly dying, the birth of the dragons. Viserys spoke of everything until his voice was hoarse and Jon could barely hear him. Eventually Viserys' voice faded away and he turned to look at Jon, his eyes wet and his face pale, and Jon thought he had never seen a more pathetic sight. His uncle looked like a broken man. "I already said I would not cast you aside, uncle," he said, his voice sharp. Viserys flinched slightly and Jon was not sure if it was because of what he had said or because of his tone, and they settled into silence. "You and Dany are so alike," Viserys finally said, hours later. "She still loves me, despite all that I have done. She forgave me." "You are her brother," he replied, turning to look at his uncle. "Her blood." "And yours," Viserys whispered, his eyes flicking away from Jon as though he could not bear to watch and hear the rejection he thought was coming. "And mine," he agreed. Illuminated by the flicking flames nearby, he was able to see as Viserys closed his eyes and breathed out deeply. Then his uncle staggered to his feet and gazed down at Jon and offered him his hand. He did not pause as he grasped his uncle's hand in his own and let him haul him to his feet. They separated quickly and Viserys bent down to pick up his sword, and then they walked slowly back to Riverrun in silence. Around the battlefield many of the men had now been seen too, but the smell of death and burnt flesh hung on the air. Several times he glanced at Viserys, who looked slightly sickened, the flames casting shadows onto his already pale face, doing nothing to make his uncle look more confident. Instead, Viserys looked more like a child than ever. "I shall need to talk to Lord Hoster Tully," he said eventually. "The Riverlands have not yet pledged to my cause. I would have you there." Viserys was silent for a moment with his eyes fixed on the ground under their feet, as he made sure he did not stumble on debris from the battlefield. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he replied, but was spared from saying anything further as a group of soldiers approached them. "Your Grace, Prince Viserys. The soldier at the front, a veiled man clad in the colors of House Royce, said, bowing as he spoke. Behind him, the other soldiers did likewise and then rose back up. Lord Royce sent me with an update. He sends his apologies that he cannot meet you himself, he is overseeing the pyres. When Jon nodded, the soldier pressed on, the battlefield is nearly cleared. All the injured men that fought alongside us have been taken to tents. There are several hundred injured Lannister soldiers who are being treated still, and more still, who are less injured, in the cells. Thank you. Any news from Prince Oberyn's party? No, Your Grace. He nodded, having half expected the response. When the soldier did not move or make to turn away, he said, is there another matter? Yes, Your Grace. Lord Royce wishes to know what you would have us do with the dead horses. Leave the horses that fell closest to the dragons, he replied shortly. He glanced at his uncle. How many will Aerion need? Less than one a day, Viserys replied slowly, as though surprised he was being consulted. Perhaps half, but better to give him more than he needs. Agreed. He turned his attention back to the soldier. Leave about 16. The meat might rot, the soldier replied carefully, as though worried Jon would take offense. Between the dragons and the direwolves, I am sure it will be fine, he replied. If it is not, they will not mind if we take some for our own supplies. Just let Prince Viserys or I know before you approach. Have the rest butchered. The men can have as much as they can eat in the next week for themselves, sold the rest. ****. He found himself stood alone on the bank of the Red Fork and watched as Ghost and Grey Wind chased each other in the slow-moving shallows. Above him, Winter and Aerion were circling each other and letting out little roars every now and then, almost as though they were playing. He was not quite sure he could call it playing, but there was a sense of joy and excitement coming through his bond with Winter, and he thought that if she were human, it would be akin to playfulness. He closed his eyes and tilted his head back up toward the sun and inhaled deeply. He knew he should be doing something, even if it was just sleeping, but his mind would not relax. His thoughts flitted between worry for Viserys, anger at what Viserys had done, and grief for all Viserys and Daenerys had suffered. He knew many of his men would condemn Viserys if they knew what his uncle had done, and part of Jon wanted to agree with them. But, despite all that, there was a part of him that felt as though his uncle could not fall any further, that he needed a chance. It was the part that he thought sounded most like Aemon. He was not sure how long had passed, but his face was warm, and Ghost and Grey Wind were quiet, clearly having worn themselves out by the time someone approached him. The sound of broken branches and the chink of armor gave the person away, although they did stop some distance from him. He opened his eyes and turned slightly, smiling as his eyes lit on Oren Waters. Lord Oren. Oren, if it please you, Your Grace. He nodded. Oren, please join me. He turned back around and watched Grey Wind and Ghost as they collapsed on the edge of the river. I hope you do not mind me approaching you, Your Grace. I do not, he replied. Then he glanced at the man next to him, and please do not call me Your Grace every time you speak to me. Our families were joined once, and, even if they had not been, you and your brother have done more than enough to earn the right to speak to me more informally, at least in private. Oren smiled at him. When the silence between them stretched past the point at which Jon expected to end, he turned away from the direwolves and looked at Oren. You are concerned about my uncle. He considered the man carefully for a moment and then sighed and said, I spoke to him last night. He told me of all that has happened to him. He paused for a moment and then said, dropping his voice so that he was sure no one could overhear him, but I would hear what you have to say. You spent moons with him. Prince Viserys' life has not been without challenge, Oren said quietly, his grey eyes still fixed on Jon as he moved slightly closer to avoid being overheard. It does not excuse what he did, and I do not make apologies for him, they are his alone to give. When I first met him and Daenerys, I feared I would have to take his life to save hers. He was cruel and vicious. He treated her poorly. Some days I feared him half mad, and I think he was. You worried he would kill her. Yes. Yet you counseled me last night to speak with him and listen. I did, Oren acknowledged. The night Daenerys' husband died, there was a fight and her life was at risk. I will spare you the details, for you say he has already told you of what happened. But, Ser Jorah Mormont and I were not close enough to ensure her safety, and one of the Dothraki who rode with her husband went to kill her. It was Viserys who saved her. All he had been until that point changed in an instant. I cannot say for sure what it was, but he saved her life and the life of her son. And whilst she delivered her son, Viserys would not leave her side, not even for a moment. They have still argued, and they still disagree on much, but he was much changed by what happened. And much changed still by the birth of the dragons. Jon regarded the other man carefully for a moment. You speak of them informally. I would name them both friend, if I did not think Prince Viserys would balk at such a suggestion. Oren murmured. There is much I have not told you, your grace, and I think it is best that it comes from Viserys and Daenerys. Yet, I would say that Viserys wishes to be better. He tries to be better. He has fought to be better. He continues to fight. He will fight for you, if you and others let him. He does not always succeed, and sometimes he errs, and he makes foolish decisions or says things that are cruel. But he is not what he once was. And your advice? Do not cast Viserys aside simply because he is not well. He is trying to be a better man for Daenerys and for Rhaegar. Others will look at him and they will see weakness or someone to manipulate. They would be wrong. Prince Viserys is weak, but he loves his sister and his nephew. He has suffered much and has inflicted much suffering on others. He himself would say that the good does not wash out the bad. I am sure that, in time, others may hear of what he did and advocate that he be removed. But I would argue that if he has the presence of mind to acknowledge his mistakes, and to regret what he has done, then he deserves a chance. I have no intention of casting my uncle aside, he replied eventually. But I am glad that he has a friend who cares for him so deeply that they would stand before their king and ask for leniency. Oren flushed, picking up on the words that Jon had not said, that others would not have taken Oren's plea so well. Their eyes met again and he smiled at the man, taking away from the bite in his previous words. You had already decided what you planned to do though, had you not, your grace? I had, he acknowledged. But you wished to hear my argument anyway. Might I ask why? Because I wished to know what sort of man you are, Oren Waters. Are you the sort of man who goes with the tide, or do you fight it? I would have the latter, not the former, by my side when I retake the Iron Throne. 299 AC Robb Stark. He had known his grandfather was sick and he could not help but feel the grief bubbling up inside him for the man he had never known and never met prior to the last few days. Hoster Tully must have been handsome and strong in his youth, much like his uncle Ed Muir, he thought. But now Lord Tully could barely sit up in his bed and instead relied on a small mountain of pillows to stop him from falling backward. He was a pale man, withered and old, with an air of exhaustion that lingered over him. Yet there was still a spark in his eyes that made Robb think that his grandfather still had his mind in a way that few older people did. Would you have from the Riverlands, your grace? The Lannister army is broken, Jon said quietly from where he stood at the end of Lord Hoster's bedside, his hands locked together behind his back and his eyes fixed on the old man. House Stark and the North have sworn to me. House Baratheon and the Stormlands have sworn to me. House Tyrell and the Reach has sworn to me. Half the Knights of the Vale are mine to command. Prince Oberyn has sworn his spear to me and the support of House Martell and Dorne. I would have the Riverlands and House Tully as well. And the price? There is no price. The war is as good as over. All that House Lannister have left is King's Landing and any support in the Crown lands. There was a small pause and Lord Tully inclined his head. And our reward for fighting alongside you whilst the Stormlands and Reach remain conspicuous by their absence. What would you have? He glanced away from his uncle and back to his brother, recognizing the tone in Jon's voice. Next to him, Viserys Targaryen had clearly noted the change in Jon's voice as well, for his head had whipped around from where the man had been gazing out at the rising sun so quickly that there was an audible click. As he watched, the man uncrossed his arms and his hands drifted down to the side. His right hand thrummed against the pommel of his sword. My son is still unwed, and you have an aunt of a marriageable age. Let us bind our houses together through marriage. No. He had half expected his grandfather to react in anger, but instead Hoster Tully leaned back further against his pillows and gave Jon an expectant look. And why not? She cannot wed my grandson, for he is married to Lady Margaery Tyrell. Bran is a cripple and Rickon is too young. She cannot wed Robert Arryn. I cannot imagine you will reward my daughter so for her inaction during this war. She cannot wed a Martell, for you cannot take the risk they will not seek to use any sons she has against you. She would be wasted wed to Willers Tyrell when you have already secured their support. She cannot wed a Lannister. Who else would you wed her to in order to help secure your claim? Next to him, Viserys ground his teeth audibly enough that Robb could not help but move further away from him. My aunt will wed who she wishes, Jon said eventually, his voice soft but firm. Robb watched as Jon's eyes darted to Viserys and then back again. Marriages build alliances. Lady Catelyn is wed to my father. That is an alliance. His grandfather made to open his mouth to reply, but, before Hoster Tully could speak, Viserys had pushed himself away from the wall. All eyes in the room turned to Viserys, but Robb turned his attention to Jon, who had snapped his own head around to look at his uncle. There was something in Jon's eyes as he assessed his uncle that made Robb both nervous and curious, a concern that made him think that, perhaps, Jon felt Viserys was unpredictable. My sister has been wed and has a child of her own already. She will not marry again unless it is to a man she wishes. If your son wishes to wed a woman who has an heir already and manages to convince my sister that he is worthy of her affection, then I shall see them wed myself. Until then, your king has spoken. As Viserys spoke, Jon's eyes widened fractionally before a small smile that Robb was half convinced he would not have noticed before this accursed war flicked over his lips. Clearly, Viserys had done as Jon hoped despite his brother's clear fears that he would not. Viserys had supported Jon. His brother inclined his head toward Viserys and turned back to Hoster Tully. As my uncle states, Lord Tully, my aunt will marry a man of her choosing. I understand that is not what many will expect nor be pleased with, but it is our decision as her family. Very well. ***. He arrived early to the Great Hall 2 days later, having spent much of the intervening time by his grandfather's bedside and resting. He had not had a chance to sleep much the night before, and the lack of sleep since the battle was taking its toll. He felt slow and as though keeping his eyes open was costing him a great effort. As he entered the hall he realized, abruptly, that he was not just early, he was very early. Other than two figures huddled together at the end of one of the long tables and several servants in one of the corners, the room was empty. He knew he did not need to get to know Viserys Targaryen, and he knew that many of his father's bannermen, and his grandfather, would not wish to spend much time in the man's presence, and in Robb's view that was even more of a reason to get to know him. Until Jon decreed it otherwise, Viserys was his heir. Jon had touched several times on his worries about what Viserys and Daenerys may have gone through, and he knew from what father had said about Robert that the lives of the Targaryen children had not been easy. He had seen the look that Jon had given Viserys last night. And whilst he did not think Viserys was a risk to Jon, he had seen what happened on the battlefield. After all, he did want to get to know the man, and he wanted to be sure. He heaved out a sigh and made his way over toward where the Bastard of Driftmark and Viserys Targaryen sat at opposite sides of the table with their heads bent together, ignoring the food on the table between them. "Might I join you?" he asked once he was close enough. "Lord Robb, please," Oren Waters said, half rising to his feet and gesturing for Robb to sit next to him. Robb took the seat next to Oren Waters and opposite Viserys. There was a brief pause whilst a servant placed some food in front of him, and then whilst he ate a few mouthfuls of stew. "You fight well, Prince Viserys," he said, when it became clear that neither of the two men would talk. "I watched you spar with Jon last night. It is an unusual style." "Oren taught me," Viserys replied, his eyes flashing to the man next to Robb. There was a moment where the two shared a look that Robb could not decipher, and then it was broken when Viserys turned back to Robb. "I had little skill before I met him." He nodded. "And you, Lord Oren, where did you learn to fight?" Oren Waters put down his spoon and turned to look at him. "I have spent many years traveling between Essos and Westeros. I spent some time in Braavos and in the Summer Isles. Every crew I sailed with was different, and there is not much to do on the deck of a ship when the seas are calm, and the wind is strong, other than spar. Will you teach me?" Viserys' eyebrows rose fractionally, and he looked between Oren and Robb for a moment before he turned his head back down to his porridge, and a smile slipped over his lips as though he knew precisely what Robb was doing. "I saw you on the battlefield, Lord Robb. I do not know what you think I could teach you that you do not already know." "My father would say we can always learn more," he replied. "Besides, there is little we can do until we hear from Prince Oberyn and the Reach. You mean to use me as a distraction until your lady wife's father arrives and you are forced to answer for the fact you wed her without her father's permission. He grimaced but was saved from responding when Viserys spoke. What is your lady wife like, Lord Robb? He flushed at the emphasis Viserys had put on your but took the opening. Intelligent. Fierce. Beautiful, he replied. Then he grinned more widely and said, she keeps me guessing. She is smarter than anyone else I know, something she apparently learnt at the hands of her grandmother, and she is kind. She dotes on my little brothers and lets Sansa bother her with 1,000 questions and indulges Arya when she is being a menace. A menace. Arya wishes she were born a boy, he said after he had swallowed a mouthful of now slightly cold porridge. She loves to spar and to ride her horse, and she is a better archer than anyone I have ever met. She is stubborn, and my mother would say she disregards her position. Her and her direwolf, Nymeria, are constantly causing trouble and mischief. Do your brothers and sisters all have direwolves? They did, he murmured. Sansa's direwolf was killed on the orders of Robert Baratheon. A brief flash of sympathy flitted across Viserys' face, and Robb knew instantly then the man was thinking of his dragon outside. And your sister, Prince Viserys? Will you tell me of Princess Daenerys? He asked, watching as the slight cloud that had lingered over Viserys lifted for a moment. Daenerys is. Viserys paused for a moment and flushed a bit. He cast his gaze down to the table and gnawed on his lip, and then, finally, after a moment lifted his eyes back to Robb with eyes slightly wet. Words cannot describe Daenerys, Viserys said eventually. She is kind, too kind, in truth, and she is caring, and she is fierce. I would not dare to cross her. There was another pause. It was she who hatched the dragons. Dragons. 3. Aerion, Balerion and Jaerion. Dany has claimed Balerion for herself, and her son, Rhaego, has bonded with Jaerion. He grinned at Viserys then, unable to help himself. 4 dragons, he said, his voice taking on a wistful note. It was one thing to know of Winter and then to see you and yours, but to know there are 2 more out there. They are only small, Viserys said quietly. Just children, in truth. A few moons old. Aerion did not look like a child on the field of battle, he replied. He may be small, but he is fierce. And you? You said all your brothers and sisters have direwolves. I do not think I have seen yours. He grimaced. Grey Wind has a fondness for rivers and dirt. He spent the night in the stables, they would not let him in the castle. There was another brief pause, and then Viserys pushed his empty bowl of porridge away and glanced up at him. I need to find Aerion. We have only spent a few nights away from each other since he was born, and I fear what he will get up to if not properly supervised. There was another pause, and Robb felt like Viserys was, perhaps, steeling himself for a moment before he said, it does him good to meet new people. Would you like to meet him? He almost knocked the bench over in his haste to rise to his feet and take the offer from Viserys. And then we can spar. They left the hall together, heading out through the square courtyard in the center of the keep and over the drawbridge until they were in the middle of the encampment. There was a brief pause as Viserys closed his eyes and seemed to contemplate something for a moment, and then he spun on the spot and strode off toward the river. He followed Viserys quickly, nearly tripping in his haste to keep up. Viserys was taller than him, with long legs that strode out, carrying him further than a man with an average stride could hope to walk. They did not talk as they walked, given that Viserys maintained his long stride and it was all Robb could do to keep up, but Oren shot him a few small smiles as though he was trying to reassure Robb. They strode together toward the bank of the Red Fork, where Robb had stood with father after the battle and confided his worries about what might happen next, and stood in silence for a few moments. He glanced around them, taking in the long reeds and the docks that jutted out slightly to allow small boats barely big enough for 10 people to be boarded. The scene at the Red Fork was completely different from behind him, where the mountains of bodies had been burned only the day before. Even as he thought about it, the smell of charred corpses hit his nose. He is with Winter, Viserys said, breaking the silence. They will be here shortly. You can feel him. Viserys cast him a brief look. His eyebrow raised. You seem surprised. I had not thought that the bond Jon shared with Winter would be the same for all dragons and their riders, he said slowly, worrying that he had offended the other man. It makes sense, of course. Dany has much the same relationship with Balerion, and Rhaegar with Jaerion, Viserys replied. His eyes remained fixed on the sky when he next spoke. Your bond with Grey Wind. Is it the same? I. There was another moment of silence as they both watched the sky above them. Then, suddenly, Viserys jerked his head slightly to the west and Robb turned as well. Hundreds of feet in the air and racing toward them, the two dragons were flying above the Red Fork. The smaller dragon was almost impossible to see from the distance away they were, but Winter was easily recognizable. There was a soft snort from next to him and he wrenched his eyes away to look at Viserys. Playing around the edge of his mouth was the first, true, smile he thought he had seen from the other man. It changed Viserys' haggard and tired face completely, making him look younger and far more handsome. For one moment, his mind turned to Sansa, who had always longed for a golden-haired prince, and he couldn't help but think that this Viserys he was looking at now would have been her ideal match but a year ago. He turned back to the dragons, who were far closer now. As he watched, the smaller dragon darted to the side and then up, looping over the top of Winter and let out a burst of fire followed by a loud screech. Winter dived down, moving away from the smaller dragon. He squinted and watched as Aerion gave chase, unable to keep up and screeching his frustration. He is trying to impress her, Viserys murmured, his tone fond. And I believe she has rebuffed him. Unfortunate, he replied. Although understandable, you said he was born but a few moons ago. He must be but a child to her. They watched together as Aerion tried to bite Winter's tail, but she flicked it away from him as she soared over them. Aerion let out another, angry, screech and tried to bite her tail again. They will not land, Viserys said eventually, his eyes fixed on the two dragons circling each other above. He is persistent in his desire to impress her. I am not sure if I should admire him, or pity him, he murmured, watching as Winter locked her jaws around Aerion as the smaller dragon failed to dodge her in time. Do not pity the fool. The tone of Viserys' voice gave him pause and he considered the other man carefully. Although Viserys' face had not changed and his eyes remained fixed on the dragons, there was a slight straightening to the other man's spine that made Robb think that, perhaps, Viserys was no longer thinking of the dragons. Some would argue that pity and compassion are but the same thing, just with different names, he replied. You sound like Oren. There was a noise behind him that sounded faintly like someone was trying to open their mouth to object but was unsure how to answer, and, for the first time in minutes, Robb remembered Oren Waters had joined them on their expedition to the riverbank. What say you, Lord Oren? He asked, purposefully turning away from Viserys and drawing the other man into their conversation. Should we admire the foolish dragon for his bravery or pity him, for he is sure to lose? Admire, I would say, Oren Waters replied, taking a few steps forward so that he was level with Robb and Viserys and turning to glance up at the two dragons. He must know he is doomed to fail, and yet continues to try. How can we not admire that? Interlude, 298 AC Aemon Targaryen. Dragons are not infallible, nephew, he said softly. Jon paused from where he had been throwing bits of cooked meat toward the dragon and sighing every time she failed to snatch one out of the air. The most recent piece, a rather large lump of what looked to be deer shin, had hit her between the spikes on her nose and then bounced onto the floor where it had rested for half a second before Ghost had swooped in and snatched it. You think I expect too much from her? I do, he replied. He shifted slightly on his bed and pulled his blankets more tightly up toward his chin. On the ground, Ghost whipped his head around to look at him and in one leap had jumped from where he had been resting near the fireplace onto the bed and curled up across Aemon's leg. Her greatest weakness is also yours. How? You look at her and you see Balerion, Caraxes, vigor. You look at her and you see strength and power. You see the possibility of thousands of men dying under her flames and battles being won before they have even begun. You see all that she will be, one day. You do not see her as she is now. As she will still be years from now. That is what others see as well. Some will, he acknowledged. Many will not. She is young. She will be young for years now. Remember Caraxes? Jon replied, finally glancing up from the dragon and toward Aemon. She was shot in the eye from an iron bolt from a scorpion, a once-in-a-lifetime shot that few could hope to replicate. I have done my readings, uncle. My dragon's scales will repel arrows within months and within years even swords and spears will glance off her. It would take the will of the gods themselves for another hit like the one that felled Meraxes for my dragon to suffer such a fate. Your arrogance will get her killed, he replied sharply, leaning forward and jostling Ghost. She will be a child for years, possibly even when your first child is born. Balerion was nearly 250 years old when he died. I could have lived my life twice already and still have another half-life to go before I had lived as long as the Dread. It will be years before your dragon is capable of the feats of Balerion, or before she is strong enough to burn whole armies alive, or before you can fly her from the wall to King's Landing without her needing several days' rest along the way. That is not fair, uncle. It may not be fair, but it is the truth, he said, his voice gentler this time as he realized he had truly upset Jon. Even with her current speed of growth, if you press your claim within the next few years, you will not be able to rely on her to win every battle for you. In 6 moons, or even a year, she might be able to hold her flames for minutes at a time, and she may have enough stamina that she can carry you on her back for hours. But to do the 2 things at once, they will exhaust her. I think I understand, Jon murmured, his eyes turning back to his dragon who had rolled onto her back, her distended little belly facing the ceiling and her eyes closed in utter contentment. You are saying that even though she may be strong enough to carry me on her back or to bathe flames, she will still be vulnerable. Yes, he replied. And others will see it. Every man, woman and child in the 7 kingdoms knows what happened in the dragon pit all those years ago, nephew. Shrikos and Morgul were but babes in arms. In terms of a dragon's age, their deaths were inevitable. But Tyraxes, he had lived 10 years by then. His hide was tough and his scales strong. He could fly great distances, and he could hold his flames for minutes at a time. And still he died. And still he died, he agreed. Perhaps if he had not become entangled in his chains. Perhaps if he had been able to escape. Perhaps if those swords had not been quite as sharp. Perhaps if his stamina had been greater. Perhaps, Jon whispered, his voice barely discernible above the crackling of the flames and the now gentle snores coming from the small dragon. You understand? It is all chance. All it will take is one error on your part. One lapse in judgment. One lucky strike. One good shot. It will happen in a blink of an eye, and when it does you will die. But then if everyone knows that, then I cannot press my claim, not without risking her. Of course you can. You must just be careful. Do not fly her too close to swords and spears. Do not listen to her judgment about what she can or cannot do. She will fight every decision you make that is aimed at protecting her. And you will want to cave in and let her. But you cannot. A dragon's wrath is a terrible thing, nephew. I imagine it is even worse if you are theirs. But you must let her wrath wash over you and force her to flee or to set you down if you worry for her. A low grumble echoed around the room. He glanced toward the dragon again, still on her back and her eyes closed, but her head was now tilted toward him as though she had listened to what he had to say and had disagreed. It is no easy thing, to kill a dragon, he said, watching the little dragon carefully. Her head tilted slightly, and one eye opened as she peered at him as though daring him to speak. But it can be done. The older she gets and the stronger she becomes, the safer she will be. But until that day comes, you must guard her, and you must protect her. Chapter 29, Trust. Chapter text. Chapter summary. In King's Landing, the North and the Stormlands, new plots take shape. In our interlude, Jon learns the value of a wife. Notes: next chapter will cover Jon and Daenerys during the events of this chapter. 299 AC varies. I have always found it quite amusing that my father, genius that he was lauded to be, so often failed. And in those instances when he did find success, it was only through deceit or something distasteful. I suppose when one considers it, it is not an inaccurate assessment, he agreed quietly. They feared him for what he did, Tyrion continued blithely, swaying on his feet and gazing at Varys through mismatched eyes that bore the hallmarks of a man who had consumed far too much Arbor Gold, wide, bloodshot, and a bit wet. The Reynes, the Tarbecks, the Targaryens. All through treachery or some distasteful act or another. If I am honest, I used to respect him for it, and now I wonder if it will be our doom. We are, perhaps, the most hated house in Westeros. Some, my sister would argue, his acts were those of logic, I suppose. But I never cared for the man, so treachery it will be. It should not be a crime to say that it was not his skill on the battlefield that gained him so much, but his mind. Tyrion was silent for a moment and then threw back another mouthful of Arbor gold. A shame his intelligence did not pass on to my dear sister, nor her twat of a son. Some would argue your father to be a skillful and prudent commander. They would also be twats. Some of his recent decisions were quite skillful, he remarked. Although, he rather meant skillful in that they furthered House Targaryen instead of House Lannister. Unleashing Gregor Clegane on the Riverlands was not skillful, Tyrion argued. It was prudent but not skillful. If he were a skilled commander, he would have had prepared for Jon Snow's dragon, and he would not have somehow managed to lose a battle on land where he had been encamped for moons and had the military advance in terms of experience, skill and size. I had no idea you were so skilled in military strategy. Tyrion shook his head and took another deep swig from his goblet. His eyes turned away from Varys and fixed on the fireplace next to them. I fear without him that we're quite fucked. There is no one to stop Joffrey or Cersei now. I fear that is not quite an accurate assessment of the predicament, he replied. You were in the same small council meeting that I was in, Lord Varys, Tyrion snapped. His eyes flicked to his goblet. Baelish has brought no news of Lysa Arryn nor of his quests in the north. Doran Martell has rebuffed our advances, and that's putting it politely, given our emissary returned without his tongue and we are yet to hear from Stannis Baratheon. Yet, what we do know is that he and Renly march together. My nephew makes overtures to the Iron Islands. My father is dead. My brother is in chains. Fucked feels a rather accurate description of our situation. Yes, I suppose if one must look at it like that, you are rather fucked. Tyrion's eyes raised from the goblet he had been staring into and met his. I find myself uncomfortable with your use of the phrase "you're." You are aware of my position, my friend, he murmured, leaning forward and pulling Tyrion's goblet away from his hand and placing it on the mantel of the fireplace deliberately out of the other man's reach. We have discussed this. Tyrion scowled at him, his face pulling an ugly expression that would have made any other man balk. I cannot leave Tommen, nor Myrcella. I agree. To leave them to your mother's inattention and Joffrey's attention would be a poor decision on your part. I fear every decision I make might be a poor decision. I imagine it will be. I fear that my nephew's ineptitude and stupidity will do more harm than he can yet imagine. Sending the fleet to Dragonstone, what is the little twat thinking? He is thinking that if Lord Baratheon will not willingly join him through a union, he shall force it, he replied softly. Lady Shireen does not deserve such a fate. No, she does not. But children never deserve the cruelty that is inflicted upon them. Daenerys Targaryen is there as well. I cannot imagine what he will do to her, Tyrion muttered. Well, I can. And if he is even half as bad as I fear he will be, then we will all burn before this war ends. Yes, I rather imagine you will. Tyrion glowered up at him and then was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. Varys watched him carefully, noticing how his friend's shoulders tightened and then relaxed and how Tyrion's fingers twitched with indecision, flexing open and closing into a fist. Eventually, Tyrion's eyes rose to his. You have kept things from Joffrey and my sister. You have managed, most skillfully, to thwart them at every turn. I could name you traitor and turn you over to them to face the king's justice, and we both know what sort of justice you might find. We do. I will not turn you over, Tyrion said softly. There is a great difference between deception and treachery. We have both engaged in the former and you in the latter as well. Despite the situation I find myself in, I cannot do the latter. You have been, not perhaps a friend, but a good ally. I would rather consider us to be friends. I find I am quite fond of you. Friends it is then, Tyrion said joyfully. You have a request. A favor. In time, I may ask another. You need not ask the second favor, he replied. I shall see it done. Regardless of what this current favor is. Tyrion peered up at him carefully and then nodded, a small self-deprecating smile flickering over his face. They always said I was more my father's son than Jaime. Father hated them for that. He cursed them every time the comparison was made. Yet here I stand, plotting for my family, the ones that matter, at least to ensure their survival against the ones who would see us all burn. Just as he would have done. Dare I say it, I think the shock might have killed him. A shame then, that he is already dead. Tyrion smiled more truly this time, his mismatched eyes twinkling brightly. A shame indeed, my friend. ***. He left that night, slipping into the hidden passageways between the walls and heading down in the darkness with only a torch held aloft for light, toward the streets in Flea Bottom. He came out in the cellar in the tavern he knew like the back of his hand. "Your lie. Forgive me," he murmured, turning to look upon the serving girl. "How is the babe?" "Well, Hanks." He nodded, knowing that she was not one for words. 10 gold dragons, he said, pulling out the small bag of gold dragons from the pocket of his cloak. "Head north as soon as you are able." The girl peered at him for a moment, her eyes flinty and dark, and then she jerked her head in a nod. "Sissa in Maidenpool." He nodded and pressed past her, up the stairs, drawing his hood over his head as he did. He came out behind the bar and headed toward the door, listening to the whoops and calls from the men aimed at him as the women came back out behind the bar and continued to serve. It did not take him long to get into the city, and even less time than he hoped to find himself outside the city limits heading past the harbor toward the King's Road to take himself south. The woods south of the harbor and on the other side of the King's Road were thicker, the trees more fully grown and larger than those in the north. In parts they were so thick it was impossible for 2 men to walk abreast, and although House Baratheon, and before them House Targaryen, had favored hunting in these woods, there were large parts that remained unexplored. He did not mind though, for the thick woods offered ample opportunity for hidden things to be discovered. Now was not the time for that though. He walked for several hours, glancing up every now and then toward the thick canopy above and gazing critically at the stars to ensure he was still heading where he wished to go. Eventually he appeared at the edge of a clearing where his little birds waited. Lord Varys one greeted, rising to his feet as the others with him did likewise. He glanced over them carefully, taking in the bulging bags they had with them full of the day's plunder and the thick cloaks they all wore likely stolen, then nodded to himself. Good. They were dressed well for the road, and they were all accounted for. He beckoned them over with a soft smile, resting his hand on the top of the head of the first boy who had spoken. "You know where to go. There will be work and a bed waiting for you at your new locations. When you get there, head to the stables, someone will come and find you. Do we await our leave?" He looked at the youngest girl who had spoken. "You may stay," he replied. "But war is coming to King's Landing, and I would not see you harmed. I promised when you entered my service that I would take care of you, did I not?" The girl nodded her head, her plaited hair flying about. "Good," he said. "Come." One by one the children came forward. He reached inside his cloak and pulled out several small bags of coins, enough to get each little bird to where they needed to go, and handed them out amongst them. They watched him for a few moments, as though they could not quite believe he was so freely offering them money with no request other than they flee the coming war. Then, the first little bird smiled at him, and turned around to pick up a bag with his belongings and then fled into the darkness. He watched as they all bid each other and him goodbye until, eventually, only him and 2 others were left in the clearing, a small girl, who had only recently entered his service, and a boy who was nearly a man grown now. "Your mother heads for Maidenpool," he said to the boy. "Find her there. When the war is over, if you wish to re-enter my service, then I shall gladly take you." The boy looked up at him with impossibly wide eyes and blinked owlishly before he spun on his heel, picked up his bag and cloak, and ran off into the darkness. The last little bird turned to look at him. "Come, my dear," he murmured. "We head to Haystack Hall." 299 AC Margaery Tyrell. "Lord Tywine is dead," Willers greeted her as she slid into her chair at the table in the great hall to break her fast. "His head sits on a spike in the ground outside Riverrun." She sighed and spooned some porridge into her bowl. Her eyes moved around the room to see who was awake that early as she replied, "And what of his body?" "Oberyn writes that it was misplaced." She felt her eyebrow raise. "Misplaced? What was misplaced?" "My favorite bracelet," she said, turning to greet Arya with a soft smile. "Liar." She did not reply and instead watched out of the corner of her eye as Willer's hand traveled down toward his cloak pocket. She would read the missive later then. She spooned some more porridge into her mouth and blanched slightly, dropped her spoon and then tipped a generous measure of honey into her porridge. Another mouthful later and she was content it was more edible now. Out of the corner of her eye she caught Willers shaking his head as he continued eating his bland food. "Is Lady Sansa awake yet?" "Yes, she gave me the scrolls and then headed to the stables," Willers replied, not looking at her and instead examining his porridge as though it contained a great mystery that needed unraveling. She pursed her lips, trying to stave off the urge to tip the rest of the honey into his bowl. "I would read those scrolls, brother. Soon. I want to read it too." "I had no idea you were so interested in the stocks for the cellars," Arya Willers said, leaning around her to fix Arya with a wide smile. "Your father will be most pleased that you are showing such an interest in household management." Margaery hid a chuckle at the horror that flashed across Arya's face for a moment. The girl's grey eyes widened, and her mouth opened before she managed to compose herself. Then she said, in a very Arya-type manner blunt to the point of rudeness, "Why does Sansa let you see so much of the workings of the household?" "Because I have spent years reading my father's ravens and learning by his side, whilst your sister and Bran have not had that same experience." "Why can't Lewyn help them?" "He does," Willers replied. "We sit together, and we go over the ledgers and the ravens and we plan for the upcoming winter." "It sounds boring." "It is," she agreed. "Which is why you and I always make ourselves scarce." Arya turned away from them, apparently pleased that Margaery also was not inclined to read the missives, having already forgotten that Margaery had in fact requested she read the scrolls or plan for the upcoming winter. Once she was confident that Arya was engaged in a battle of flinging porridge at Rickon, Margaery turned around to look at Willers again. "And my husband has written as well. I hope you have not read it." "What could I gain by reading the love-struck nonsense from your husband?" She flushed, turned away from him and spooned more porridge into her mouth too quickly. She threw her hand over her mouth, dropped her spoon to grab her mug of watered wine and swallowed greedily once she brought the mug to her lips. After, she sucked in a deep breath through her mouth and resolutely did not look at Willers, who she could see watching her with a smirk on his lips. They finished eating in silence. Finally, once Arya and Rickon had vanished, likely to cause chaos or carnage in the stables, she turned back to Willers. "How does one misplace a body?" "I imagine by disposing of it in the Red Fork." She grimaced. "I rather suppose it was foreseeable that such an unfortunate event might occur. Although I am rather surprised Jon Snow let it happen." She sighed. "Imagine bringing a head back in a bag to Riverrun. How grisly." "There was no bag." "Oh. Pray tell me, how did Lord Tywin's head find itself back in Riverrun if it did not travel in a bag?" "Oberyn wrote that he tied it with long rope to his horse's saddle and dragged it." "Is that what you would do for me?" As though grandmother would let anyone but her seek vengeance. She smiled sharply at Willers. "Shame on you, brother, letting grandmother have all the fun." Willers sighed and rolled his eyes at her. Then he reached into the pocket of his cloak and withdrew 3 scrolls. "Sansa and I have both read Oberyn's scroll and the missive from the king, but agreed that the one from your husband is for your eyes only." She raised an eyebrow but took the offered scrolls, unrolling the one that contained the faintly familiar hand of Oberyn Martell. "Willers, I hear you are at Winterfell. The matter we have long spoken of has been dealt with. I am afraid I misplaced a key part of the remains, but the head sits on a spike outside my tent. Lord Tully refused to let it sit on his walls, or even within his keep. The king has invited me to see where he was raised, and I have long wished to see the wall. I hope that you will remain in Winterfell until such a time as I am able to travel north. Your friend, Oberyn." "How did you dragged the head along behind his horse from misplaced the remains?" "Oberyn and I do not simply talk of horseflesh in our missives, sister. Grandmother would be very proud," she murmured. "Discussing ways of disposing of enemies in code. How quaint." Willers snorted and pushed the other 2 scrolls toward her. She took the next partially unfurled one and read it quickly. "Sister. Riverrun is secure. Your mother is likewise safe. I will shortly be departing for King's Landing. Your mother will stay in Riverrun until the war is over. Jon. He's not a wordsmith, is he?" "He is not," Willers agreed. "But Riverrun is safe. The Lannister army must have been defeated if Oberyn managed to avenge Elia, and Riverrun has been secured. He did not need to write much else, did he?" "I suppose not," she murmured. Her eyes turned to the final scroll, but instead of opening it she pulled it toward her and tucked it safely into the bodice of her dress. I shall read this later. A few hours later she had managed, finally, to wrangle Rukun into being willing to have a bath to wash off all the porridge he currently had all over himself, including in his hair. Together they wandered across the great hall, watching as the last of the household and servants finished their morning meal. I miss Mother, Rukun murmured. Bran says I shouldn't. She glanced down at him and tightened her hand around his. Of course, you can miss your mother. I miss mine. Realizing he did not look mollified, she dropped down slightly so that she was crouching in front of him and could speak more softly and said, Remember, Bran needs to be strong. He is in charge of Winterfell and the North whilst your father and brother are not here. If you miss your mother, you can always come and find me or Sansa. Rukun gazed up at her, eyes wet, and sniffled slightly. His hand tightened around hers and then he nodded slowly. Lady Margaery. She rose up instantly and turned, pulling Rukun with her as she did so. On her other side Shaggy Dog did likewise, and she rested her hand on the direwolf's massive head as he grumbled under his breath. The soldier who had been running toward her stopped several feet away. He was a Reachman, one of the few soldiers who had accompanied her north, and one who she had known since she was but a small girl. Giles, she greeted. I had thought you were relieved from your duty today. Lady Sansa sent me, my lady, he replied, looking at her deliberately and then flicking his gaze down to Rukun and then away again toward the back of the room. She raised her eyebrow and then glanced around her. Near the back of the room, she saw old Nan, who in truth gave her the creeps, although Margaery was not sure why, climbing up the steps that led from the great hall to some of the quarters. Rukun, go to old Nan. I shall come and find you later. Rukun looked up at her, then nodded sharply and scurried away, Shaggy Dog hot on his heels. She watched him run across the great hall, nearly colliding with several people on his way, before she turned back around. What has happened? Riders approach, Giles replied. A group from the south. Read banners. Lord Howland. But he only left but 4 moons ago, she murmured. Giles did not reply but instead waited for her to start walking. Once she did so, he fell into place slightly behind her, his hand moving to the pommel of his sword as he walked. She resisted the urge to tut at him, for although she was perfectly safe here, she knew that his first allegiance was to her above all. Grandmother had made sure of that. How do you find the north? She asked as 2 guards pushed open the great doors that led out to the courtyard. She stepped through and smiled as the sun hit her face. It was warmer than it had been in moons. Not a cloud in the sky and bright. Cold. She laughed. But there is a beauty to it, nonetheless. He let out a noise that might have been part grumble and part cough. Together they crossed down the stone steps and headed toward where Sansa, Willers and Bran waited. Sansa gave her a tight smile when she arrived, whilst Willers gave her a slightly softer one. Where is Arya? In the stables with Gendry, Sansa replied, just as the first riders came through the gates. I thought it best to leave her there. She nodded and slipped into position on the other side of Sansa and next to Willers. She hid a smile as the first rider barely twitched their horse's reins and the horse halted immediately. Next to her, Willers made an appreciative noise, his eyes on the horse. The rider slid smoothly down the horse's back and passed the reins over to a stable boy. Instantly, Margaery realized the rider was not male but female. She watched her carefully as she crossed the gap between her delegation and those Margaery stood with. Lady Sansa, Lord Bran, the girl said, her voice lilting upwards even as a wide smile appeared on her face. I am Meera Reed. Your brother, Jon, sent me. Margaery raised an eyebrow and cast her gaze over the girl more carefully. Now the girl was but a few feet away. Margaery realized she was no girl at all but instead a woman grown. She was nearly of an age of Margaery, with muddy green eyes and long brown hair that was tightly bound behind her head. It was simply her short stature and slim build that made her first appear as a younger boy. You are most welcome here, Lady Meera, Bran said. Please partake of bread and salt. Meera Reed did as bid as, behind her, more riders began to dismount and move their horses out of the way to a small cart could enter in. On it sat a boy, perhaps a few years younger than Margaery, who looked much the same as Meera Reed. My brother, Hojan, Meera introduced softly. ****. This is ridiculous. She took a gentle sip of her lemon tea, placed her mug back on the desk, and leaned back in her chair. On the other side of the desk, Sangza was stood, hands braced on the edge of the desk and gazing at Bran, whose chair could not fit behind the table and so sat next to Margaery with a furious expression. "You cannot go gallivanting off beyond the wall on the words of a boy barely a few name days older than you." "Jon's words as well," she murmured. "This is a family matter, Lady Margaery," Sangza snapped, turning slightly to gaze at her. She raised a delicate eyebrow, even as Willers sighed on her other side as though knowing what was coming, and said, very gently, "But we are family, Sangza. I am your sister through marriage." Sangza stared at her for a moment and then sank back down into her chair. "Bran cannot go beyond the wall. Not now." "I agree," she replied. "But I think we must at least consider why the Reed children came all this way to make such a request." Sangza pursed her lips and regarded Margaery carefully. "Does no one care what I want?" "No." She snorted at Bran's furious expression and leaned forward and raised her mug of lemon tea back to her lips. As she drank, she tried to hide her smile since Robb, Jon and Ned Stark had left. Bran and Sangza had been at each other's throats nearly daily and instead tried to force her face into a more serious expression. "I dream," Bran continued, as though Sangza had not just tried to silence him with one word. "I dream I can fly. I dream of a three-eyed crow. He says I will be able to fly. Just like Hojan said." "We all dream," Bran, Sangza said gently. "It does not mean you are seeing things that truly are. These aren't like your dreams. Dreams are dreams, Bran. You're not in charge, Sangza. I am." Next to Margaery, Willers twitched slightly and sighed quietly under his breath. She likewise shifted, smoothing down her skirts with one hand and putting the mug back to her lips to finish off her drink. "House Reed has been our ally for thousands of years. There is no house more loyal in the North," Bran continued. "Father considers Lord Howland to be his most trusted bannerman and closest friend." Margaery watched as Sangza sighed, her eyes closing and her nostrils flaring slightly. "Small Janumber remains in last hearth. Jon ordered that he keep back 1,000 men," Willers said, breaking his own enforced silence and leaning forward. As Margaery watched, he planted his cane on the floor before his legs to brace himself and continued, "Perhaps we should write to him." "And say what, Lord Willers?" "That 2 Crannog men have turned up at Winterfell and claimed my brother's destiny lies beyond the wall, and could they perhaps advise us?" "We could phrase it slightly better than that," he said. "Write to Small Janumber. Ask him if he has word of the wall or anything beyond it. He and his men were kept back because Jon was worried about the wildlings. If anyone knows why, he will." "You think there is some truth in what the Reed children have said?" Willers twitched slightly and Margaery hid a smile clearly. He, like her, thought that Sangza was being unreasonable to call Mira Reed a child given the girl was several years older than Sangza. "I think that Bran speaks true. The Reeds have been loyal to House Stark for thousands of years. Why would they put Bran at risk or themselves for a foray to the lands beyond the wall if there was not something truly urgent?" When Sangza did not reply, Margaery tried a different tact, softening her voice and putting on a beseeching expression. "Sangza, if that does not satisfy you, then did you not say your uncle Benjen was at the wall? That he is First Ranger? And Aemon Targaryen, who is the Maester? Write to them. Ask them for their advice. Ask them if they can think of any reason that Bran may need to go beyond the wall. We are all agreed that House Reed means no harm to House Stark, so until we know otherwise, I think we should at least consider that there is something we do not know." 299 AC Davos Seaworth. He could see the King's Road in the distance, wending both south toward Storm's End and north toward King's Landing. Bronze Agate was more beautiful than Storm's End and Dragonstone, with large windows that ensured every room was well lit with natural light and roaring fires in every hearth to keep the warmth. A circular keep on the top of a hill with views 4 miles around in every direction, the only entrance was through the double main gate that was heavily fortified. There were no battlements and no moat. Instead, any man hoping to gain entry into Bronze Agate would have to climb the walls up to the windows or charge the main gate. Davos could not help but think if the keep was a bit closer to the sea with a little slipway leading to the coast, then it would be the most prized castle in Westeros. Despite that, its lack of proximity to the coast made it, perhaps, the most impregnable castle he had ever seen. Practical and beautiful, it was no wonder that Lord Buckler was such a contented-looking man. The hills and fields around Bronzegitt were full of apple trees and wheat and barley, and, even as he gazed out into the distance, he could see hundreds of small folk gathering crops. It was almost easy to forget that there was no war. Almost. But, closer to the keep, the combined might of the Stormlands and troops sworn to the lords of the Narrow Sea, ruined the tranquility that Davos had been enjoying. Even as he watched, men darted about, and horses trotted through the encampment below him. Losses. He turned his gaze from the encampment below the window and back toward the lords gathered in the solar that Lord Stannis had claimed as his own. His eyes flicked over the table, taking in those present: Montford Valerian, tall and broad-shouldered, with his lips set in a perpetual smile that Davos knew was beginning to grate on Lord Stannis, Lord Ralph Buckler, the Lord of Bronzegitt and their host, Lord Renly and Loras Tyrell, Lord Dondarrion and Lord Eldon Estermont. There were more lords in their party, but Davos knew that these men, Renly and Loras aside, were the men that Lord Stannis trusted most. Or, rather, trusted in so much as Lord Stannis could trust anyone. On the table in front of where he stood, a scroll had been thrust. He glanced down toward it. He stared at the letters on the note in front of him, trying to piece together what it said for a few moments before they all began to make sense in his mind. The fleet sails on Dragonstone. My brother has left Driftmark with Prince Viserys. They were seen not 3 weeks ago riding with the Knights of the Vale with a small dragon heading toward Riverrun. I believe they will have joined the fight there, Montford Valerian said quietly, breaking the uneasy silence over the room. If the rumors of Prince Viserys and Princess Daenerys' dragons are true, then the Princess Daenerys still has 2 dragons at Driftmark. He shifted slightly, frustration seeping through him. This was the problem with war: getting information on time in a way that was truly reliable was hard, if not impossible. They had no spymaster and no clarity as to where their allies were at any given moment. All they had was this note, with no idea who it was from. Small beasts. Barely capable of breathing fire, I would imagine, Renly muttered. Not if we believe the Raven scroll that arrived at Storm's End, he interjected, alluding to the missive from Jon Snow that had gone to Storm's End and then sent, via a fresh Raven, to Bronzegitt. It had confirmed he would be heading to King's Landing within the moon following his liberation of the siege at Riverrun. Small but fierce. Montford Valerian nodded his head and leaned forward, around Davos, to gaze at Stannis. Let me send word to Driftmark. If the Princess Daenerys is there, she will answer our call for aid. 1 girl and 2 dragons not yet big enough to ride will not be enough to defend Dragonstone from the Lannister fleet, Renly remarked. We ought to turn back. There was a brief pause, and then Renly said softly, as much as it pains me to say this, can we be so sure that this note is even true? I am certain, Stannis replied. It would be the prudent move. And it would certainly explain how the Northern Army, less than a third of the Riverlands forces and the Knights of the Vale, managed to beat back an army nearly 4 times their size. They had dragons on their side. That changes the odds massively, Loras said. The boy's hand swept across the map over the table toward the 2 figurines of the dragons. And to crew the Lannister fleet would have taken thousands of men. By all accounts it was the full might of the Lannister forces at Riverrun. What say you, Sir Davos? Sir Loras speaks true, he agreed. But there are ways and means to secure crews to man the ships. You surely cannot think they would employ pirates, Lord Buckler said sharply. Even Joffrey and Cersei would not be so mad. I do not speak of pirates but the Iron Fleet. The missive does not say which fleet sails, only that one does. Lord Bolon would rebel for any reason without cause. I do not think he would align with the crown if asked or commanded. If he were so willing to sell himself and his men, he would surely have aligned with Jon Snow, Renly murmured. As he watched, a small smile flitted across Stannis' lips and then vanished in an instant. He turned away from him and said, he need not align with anyone. He need only let them think he has. He and his men will pay the iron price, and treachery is in their blood. I agree with Sir Davos, Montford Valerian said sharply, just as Renly made to open his mouth again. There are but a few fleets in Westeros that would necessitate a missive like this. Your fleet, Lord Stannis, is anchored at Storm's End. The ships that did not swear to you, Lord Stannis, are anchored in King's Landing, but there are not enough men to crew them. The Red Wine fleet will sail for Jon Snow. They would not turn traitor for fear of what Lady Olenna would do to them. That then leaves the Marndaeli fleet, the Lannister fleet and the Iron Fleet. The Lannister fleet, even numbering so small as it does, would need a few thousand men, and I agree with Lord Loras that is clear their numbers were at Riverrun. And the Mardaelis would never turn their back on a star. This is a pretty plot, aimed to force us to split our men and leave ourselves exposed. How do we know it is not the Mardaeli fleet, under the control of Jon Snow, that is heading to Dragonstone? Renly interjected. The sound of steel being withdrawn from a scabbard met Davos' ears instantly, and, although he flinched at the noise, his hand already moved to the pommel of the sword he kept strapped to his side, even if, out of everyone in the room, he was the most ineffective with a sword. There was a flurry of movement as everyone present made to withdraw their swords or daggers. Even as Davos drew his own sword, his eyes affixed on what had made the noise, Montford Valerian had a short dagger pressed against Renly's throat and the man pinned against the wall. Behind him, Loras Tyrell had drawn his own sword and had that pressed up against Montford's throat, not that Montford Valerian seemed to have noticed, nor cared. You agreed to fight alongside your brother and to support the man that same brother has named king. I did not realize you were such a feckless fool that you would turn traitor on your own blood and spout such nonsense in a room full of men sworn to that same brother and his king. Sheath your dagger, Lord Valerian. I am sure that my brother did not mean to cast aspersions on the temperament, nor honor, of our king, nor on myself. He glanced away from Lord Montford toward Stannis, who was watching the Lord of the Tides with a peculiar expression of his face. It took Davos a moment to place it, respect. It had been a long time since he had seen the expression on Stannis' face and never aimed at Lord Montford previously. He thought back on the words that Lord Montford had spoken and realized that for the first time since the two armies had joined, someone had explicitly acknowledged Stannis as the head of House Baratheon. He turned back to Lord Montford, who as expected was regarding Stannis with the same expression that Stannis was regarding him with. He watched the two men gaze at each other for a few moments before, eventually, Lord Montford lowered his dagger and inclined his head toward Stannis. All of you, leave me. Lord Montford, write to Driftmark and ask your son and Princess Daenerys to sail for Dragonstone. Lord Buckler, Sir Davos remain. Lord Montford gave Stannis a half-bow, a deferential move that even Davos knew to be unwarranted and unnecessary, and then stalked from the room, the rest of those who had been asked to leave following behind him in silence. Once the door had shut behind them, he and Lord Buckler turned their attention to Stannis. What would you have me do, Lord Baratheon? Stannis ground his teeth. Send ravens to the Arbor and to White Harbor. My lord. Stannis turned away from the map on the table and toward Lord Buckler. Even if we were to turn back now and head toward Storm's End, we would not get there in time. We cannot rely on two dragons but a few moons old. If the tides are kind, then Paxter Redwyne and whoever is crewing the Mardaeli fleet may get there either before the fleet or shortly after. The other man inclined his head in understanding. I will do so now, Lord Buckler murmured. Then he left the room without another look. The departure of Lord Buckler left him and Stannis alone in the room. He did not leave, for he had not been asked to, but instead watched Stannis for a few moments. The man was worried, Davos could tell. His hands were clenched around the edges of the table, he was grinding his teeth, and his eyes were downcast and tight at the edges. Eventually, Stannis sighed, and for the first time in years Davos saw concern and uncertainty etched into the man's face. Ever since the rebellion, Stannis had seemed so confident and so assured in himself, but not now. You should write to Jon Snow at Riverrun. He said he would spare Lady Shireen even if you did not bend the knee. If she is under threat, he will send aid, he said quietly. You seem sure that this boy you met once will save a girl he does not know. Would that I held that same confidence in him. He considered the other man carefully for a moment, trying to decide how best to proceed. I do, he said eventually. But even if he does not stand by his words, his aunt will be on Dragonstone shortly. If he does not liberate it for Lady Shireen, he will for her. Stannis stared at him for a moment and then jerked his head in a sharp nod. Very well. ***. A week later, Davos stood in the same room again, the solar that Lord Stannis had claimed as his own, watching as Montford Valerian and Stannis spoke in soft voices, barely discernible even to him despite the fact he was stood next to them. Even as he tilted his head to try and hear them better, Montford Valerian's hand drifted across the map, tracing an imaginary route from the Arbor to Dragonstone. A moon. As one, both men turned toward him. Stannis raised an eyebrow. Yes, less than a moon I wager, he replied quickly. Perhaps 2 to 3 weeks if the tides are kind. Stannis nodded at him and then turned back to the map, moving the ships they had ordered carved to represent the various houses and fleets across it. Davos tried not to stare at the way the other man's hand lingered in Dragonstone for a moment. Almost as though he was aware of Davos' thoughts, Stannis moved his fingers away from Dragonstone and toward King's Landing. We should make sure we are able to march within the day. I believe it will all move quickly from here, he said softly. By the end of this year, we may well be back home. There was something in Stannis' voice that gave Davos pause for a moment, perhaps longer. His eyes moved from Stannis to Lord Montfort, who was regarding Stannis with a slightly sympathetic expression that he instantly wiped from his face when he realized Davos was looking at him. Almost as soon as the look on Montfort's face had vanished, Davos realized what the look on Stannis' face had been and what his voice had been implying, that Stannis was not sure he wished to leave Dragonstone. He supposed it made sense. Stannis had never viewed Dragonstone as his home. Storm's End was his birthright. Yet now it was under threat and Shireen was there. Stannis' feelings had changed slightly and he was now viewing the keep in a different light. Lord Montfort, I would speak to Sir Davos alone. Of course, my lord. They watched together as Montfort left the room, head held high and strides long and purposeful. Almost as soon as the door had snapped shut behind him, Stannis turned to Davos. We are yet to hear from Jon Snow. It was said in a tone of voice that left Davos in little doubt that Stannis judged that Davos had erred in his judgment of the king. We are also yet to hear from White Harbor or the Arbor, he replied, trying his best to maintain a flat expression, knowing that Stannis was both frustrated and worried. It has been a week. It takes nearly 5 days for ravens to get from here to the wall, and we sent ravens nearly that same distance to the Arbor and to White Harbor. We must be patient. Would that I had your faith in him. It is not just faith. Stannis sighed and wiped his hand down his face slowly and onto his neck, as though trying to compose himself. Lord Montfort supports me because I support his king. Renly supports me in so much as he is capable of doing so because he knows now, he has no choice. The others support me because they likewise know they have no choice. If there was another option, they would stab me in the back, I am sure. I disagree, he replied softly. When Stannis' eyes flashed to his, he pressed on, Renly is your brother. Yes, he joined his forces with yours, but he has also deferred to you on many matters since we left Storm's End. Despite what has happened between you, you are blood. You sound like Cresson. The highest compliment I could hope for. If any other man were to say that, I would name them a liar. But not you. There was a brief pause and then Stannis said, he will take Lord Valerian as his master of ships. He may wish to make him hand. Perhaps, Stannis allowed. It is unlikely though. There was another brief pause. You said he agreed I could have any man of my liking on his small council. That is what he promised. I hope you do not take offense that I will not be recommending you. He whipped his head away from where he had been slightly studying the map to look at Stannis. My lord. I did not think I would be. Of all the men in my army. Of all the lords who are in this keep, there is not one I trust the judgment of more. If we were in Storm's End, I would have sent you back to Dragonstone for my daughter and for Cresson. He stared at Stannis, part of his mind picking up that the man had made no reference to his wife, and the rest of it focusing on the praise that he had not expected to hear. I have said it many times, Sir Davos, that I wish I had more men like you. That is why, despite the fact you are capable, and I hold you in high regard, I will not be recommending you serve Jon Snow. He made to open his mouth to reply, to say that he had no wish to serve Jon Snow and that his loyalty was to Stannis and always would be, but the door burst open, slamming back against the wall and then careening back again, nearly hitting the man rushing through in the face. Lord Buckler darted out the way just in time and bent over, bracing himself on his legs for a moment and taking deep, gasping breaths, before he straightened. He was bright red, sweat dripping down his face but smiling broadly. A scroll from Riverrun. Lord Buckler choked out, taking a few steps forward. He descended into heavy coughs, hacking out large globules of spit, leaning over the table to brace himself and presenting a scroll to Stannis. Came straight here. Stannis took the offered scroll quickly, unfurling it with less grace than Davos had ever seen. His eyes skimmed over the short missive, once, twice, 3 times. Then, His eyes closed for a moment, and he breathed in deeply. His hand clenched tightly around in his hand before it relaxed, and he tossed it toward Davos. He snatched it quickly and read it just as fast. It will take at least a week, perhaps longer if the winds are not kind. Until you hear from me, stay garrisoned where you are. 299 AC Theon Greyjoy. White Harbor was beautiful. Winterfell would always be his home, he knew that. But there was a peacefulness that came with being in White Harbor that made him feel like he belonged. He had been at White Harbor for 5 moons now, waiting for the Raven from Riverrun to confirm that the fleet under Wendell Mardalis' control could sail south and that they were to blockade to King's Landing. He had expected to be put to work immediately on the ships, but instead, Wyman Mardalis had taken him aside and told him that for the first moon he was to enjoy the delights White Harbor had to offer. He had balked at first, wondering if it was a trap that they were giving him free rein to see if he would run. It had not even crossed his mind that he should run. Why would he? Jon had trusted him enough to have him in his council meetings before he had flown to the Wall, and Ned Stark had trusted him enough to let him go to White Harbor and had told him he cared for him as a son. There was no reason to run, not anymore. The first few days he had done little but explore the giant keep. He had always thought Winterfell to be grand and beautiful, and it was, but White Harbor and Newcastle were something else entirely. The whitewashed walls rose hundreds of feet above the city below it and, somehow, maintained their brightness so much that when the sun rays caught on it after a storm the walls would throw thousands of rainbows into the air. The towers all flew the merman sigil of House Mardalis, and from his chambers he could see both the city's harbors and, most incredibly, on a clear day, the Bight in the distance. The halls, corridors and rooms were bright and airy in stark comparison to Winterfell, where the corridors and rooms had always seemed a bit too dark. He had grown used to Winterfell and in many respects, come to love its bleakness, but there was something about White Harbor that just felt right. It felt like home. When he had, finally, been brave enough to venture outside of the keep and down Castle Stair toward the city below, he had half expected to be left alone to fend for himself. He had been wrong. Instead, he had been joined by Winifred and Wyler Mardalis, who had accosted him as he made to head out the great gates of the keep and taken one of his arms each and dragged him down Castle Stair. He had the good sense not to fight them, for both girls had already proven themselves to be more than capable of fighting their own corner. In the weeks and moons that followed, he had grown fond of both Winifred and Wyler, although Wyler was, mayhaps, a tad too excitable for his liking, reminding him slightly of Arya. He would miss it here. The Raven from Riverrun had arrived the day before, and 2 days before that, the Raven from Bronze Eggett asking for aid and for them to go to Dragonstone. They would leave on the morrow. The ships had been ready for weeks, but men were harder to corral, and plans needed to be made. They had planned to sail straight to King's Landing, but Dragonstone was a different beast, tides more treacherous, and the shallows dotted around the island apparently hid sharp rocks that could tear straight through a ship's hull. They would be hard-pressed to get to Dragonstone before the fleet. But still they would try, for even sequestered away from the fighting as they had been so far, they had heard rumors of Stannis Baratheon bending the knee. They had already been considering what aid they could send when Jon's Raven had arrived, instructing them to sail for Dragonstone immediately and that he would join them there. The shrill laughter of children playing in the shallows of one of the rivers that fed the sea brought him abruptly back to the present. He sighed and rubbed a hand down his face, pushing his hair away from it and using the opportunity to stifle a yawn. "You are quiet today." He didn't turn to look at Winifred, knowing what he would see on her face without having to look. "I am just thinking. Grandfather said that he has never known Lord Stannis call for aid," Winifred continued softly. "He thinks it must be most dire if Lord Stannis has asked not just House Mardalis but also the Red Wine Fleet for aid, as the king reports." "His daughter is on Dragonstone," he replied. "It does not mean that it will be a hard siege to lift or that we are truly needed." Winifred snorted indelicately. "You are doing a poor job of convincing me, and an even poorer job of convincing yourself." There was a brief pause, and then he felt her hand grasp his, between them on the grassy bank. "You can be scared, Theon. I will not think less of you." "I'm not scared." "Yes, you are," she said quietly. "We all know it is likely the Iron Fleet that is sailing toward Dragonstone. That is your family, Theon. Your blood. Instead of simply fighting for House Stark and the North, you will now be fighting against your family. House Stark is my family, he snapped, his voice sharp and leaving no room for argument. He could feel her gaze on him and almost see the smile on her lips. This was the thing he had learnt about Winifred over the last few moons. She was, perhaps, the most perceptive person he had ever met. She was not like her grandfather, Lord Wyman, who was shrewd and intelligent, hiding it well and letting others believe he was craven, but rather Winifred was blessed with a woman's intelligence and an understanding of what to say when and, more importantly, how to say it. It reminded him, in many ways, of Lady Stark. At first, it had set him on edge. She had seen him, the real him, and it had scared him, but, as the weeks began to slip by, he began to appreciate it. He never had to say what he truly meant, nor how he felt, because she understood it already. Just as, right now, she knew he was scared, but she would not push the topic. Wyler was different. There was a naivety around her that made Theon think that mayhaps, her father and grandfather and even Winifred to an extent had tried to protect Wyler her entire life. She was brave and fearless and more open in her views than Winifred, but she lacked a certain cunning that Theon saw in Winifred, Wyman and to an extent Wendell Marndale. "I am," Winifred said simply, bringing his attention back to her. He turned sharply toward her. Her eyes were closed, head tilted back, her toes were dangling into the shallows as the river rushed past them, and she seemed for all the world completely content. But there was a tension to her mouth and furrow to her brow that told him she was worried. "I fear for father. I fear for Uncle Wendell. I fear for Wyler and myself. I fear for you. War is a bloody thing, Theon. It makes fools of good men, and it gives those who are not the opportunity to engage in acts that would otherwise be frowned upon. Will you go to Winterfell?" Winifred shook her head, opening her eyes and turning to look at him. "My place is at White Harbor. With father and uncle away fighting for the king, grandfather needs me here." He deliberately kept his face stoic, unwilling to voice the fears that entered his mind. "I shall be quite safe, Theon. Lady Margaery and I are in contact every few days," Winifred said gently, her voice pitched so as to try and avail him of his fears without causing offense. "She will alert me to any news from the south and, in turn, I shall ensure that Winterfell remains alert to any possibilities of ships coming up the Bight. I am not worried for you." "Liar," she said, barking out a laugh. "But I shall simply name you a liar and let you continue to lie to yourself." "Winifred," he began carefully. He did not want her to push the matter they had already discussed so many times even more, but he could not help but worry for her alone in White Harbor with less than 100 men. "Come, let us head back to Newcastle. Grandfather is preparing a feast." "Lord Wyman is always preparing a feast," he replied. He hauled himself to his feet, not bothering to wipe the mud off himself, and then stuck out a hand to help her get to her feet. They walked together side by side, talking quietly about nothing of importance. It was only as they drew closer to the city again that he realized that Winifred was so close to him that he could feel the warmth from her breath against his cheek. He flushed and took a half step back. Winifred raised an eyebrow but otherwise did not comment. As they walked past the first of the docks, he glanced toward the ship he would be sailing on in the morn. Next to him, he was aware that Winifred had stopped walking and was watching him carefully, but he paid her no mind. His eyes fixed on the sails of the ship and the men rushing around on deck that he could just see in the distance. He flinched slightly, lost in his own mind as Winifred pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek and murmured, "I shall see you shortly." Then before he could react, she turned and was swallowed up by the darkness of the streets of White Harbor. He made to turn his eyes back to the ship in the distance, but before he could fully turn a voice spoke out of the shadows, "I thought she would never leave." He spun around, drawing the dagger he kept strapped to his belt as he did so. In the shadows, nearly invisible until he was looking for it, stood a short slender man. He raked his eyes over the man carefully, taking in his clean and crisp clothing and his immaculately maintained hair and stubble. "I have a proposition for you, Theon Greyjoy." Interlude, 298 AC Aemon Targaryen. "Which of our ancestors do you think was the best king? Who said it had to be a king?" Jon looked at him as though Aemon had announced he believed he would fly if he jumped from the top of the wall. "There has never been a woman who sat on the Iron Throne," Jon replied. "Rhaenyra was not queen, not really. It is not Rhaenyra of who I speak." Jon was silent for a moment, his gaze flicking from his dragon once again curled up in a ball in the fireplace, the flames licking over her, to Ghost curled up on Eamon's bed and back again. "You speak of Alysanne?" "Of course," he replied. "She watched her family destroy themselves. She watched as her brother's throne was stolen from him. She watched as another brother was tortured. And still she grew strong. She was not there for it though. That does not matter, does it? She knew what happened. We all know what happened, John. Just because you are not present for the event itself does not mean you do not feel its ramifications most grievously. Why her? Why not Jaehaerys? He was king. He was king," he agreed softly. "He was a remarkable king, and a remarkable man. By all accounts, he was everything we could ever hope a king to be. He sought to do all he could to improve the lives of all those he was responsible for. He ordered that the King's Road be built. But he also deferred to his wife on many matters, and, when he became too old to rule, he let his hand rule for him." "The first night? Otto Hightower?" "Yes. You think that he should not have acted as he did? I think that what he decided to do about the first night is neither here nor there. How can one be the best of House Targaryen when he did not relinquish the throne when he could no longer rule? Why Alysanne then? She was not perfect, she was flawed. You have told me as much. She was. She caused irreparable harm to her children. They both did, in truth. But we are not speaking of what they did for House Targaryen, nephew, but what they did for the realm. But are they not as important as each other?" "They are. But you asked me who I thought the best king was, and I am answering that question. Ask me another time who you thought the best Targaryen for our family was." "Very well," Jon murmured. As Aemon watched, Jon shifted slightly and turned so his back was to the fireplace and he could gaze at Aemon more easily. Jon's legs came up and he wrapped his arms around them and regarded Aemon carefully. Alysanne was kind, smart and did not discriminate between nobility and small folk. Where my brother, Egg, favored the small folk to his detriment, Alysanne loved both equally. She wanted to create a better kingdom, for both. She was fearless and brave, he began. He considered his next words carefully, wondering how best to phrase what he wished to say. Alysanne saw things, perhaps, through a lighter lens than many. It was she who advocated for Rhaenys the queen that never was to be named heir when Aemon died. She was optimistic and, perhaps, naive. But she was also right, even if she did not know it. She did much for the realm, although so much is credited to her husband, even though we all know what she did. That she was his strength in many ways. When she died, Jaehaerys could not rule without her, not in the end. Perhaps if he had been of sounder mind, he may have understood the point his queen had made all those years before, that being a woman did not mean Rhaenys was not capable of ruling, and instead of Viserys being his heir, and all that followed, it would have been Rhaenys. The lords of Westeros would never accept a woman for a ruler. They would not, he agreed. But they would accept a queen who was equal. At least, if it was the right queen. "You are speaking of a future wife for me," Jon replied sharply. "How is it, uncle? I can ask a question and you can turn it into a lesson. It is a skill. One that I have honed for years." Jon smiled at him, the slight miffed look vanishing from his face in an instant. "I hope that one day I shall have that skill and your wisdom." He smiled back and leaned over slightly to pet Ghost, who tilted his head to look up at him and gave a long, languid stretch, and then closed his eyes and snuggled down again. "What is the lesson you think I have tried to impart? To not neglect the woman that I must take for a wife. And to recognize that you cannot do everything, you are not infallible, and a king does not rule alone. Your father relied on my mother's counsel before he became king," he replied softly. "If my mother had still been alive, I think my father may have been the greatest Targaryen king that ever lived. She softened him in so many ways. After she passed, he lost much joy. When he became king, he was quite lost without her, I believe, and that was why he wished me to stay in King's Landing. In the end, he took Bloodraven for his hand, a man who was smart and had served another before my father." "He chose a strong hand," Jon murmured. "He had no one else, so he chose a hand who had helped rule wisely." "Yes. What of Egg? Bertha was not Alysanne, and she was not my mother. She had little interest in ruling and even less interest in helping my brother rule. We spoke before about how few eligible women there are for me to wed, John murmured. Once I then consider who might be able to provide the challenge and the support that you say I will require, and I believe I will, I cannot think of any. You will find one, he murmured. And there is no rush. Just remember, a man with a wife he does not trust, is a terrible thing. A man with a wife whose counsel he does not listen to, is a terrible thing. A king with a queen who cannot understand that the realm must come first, is a terrible thing. When the time comes for you to choose a wife, pick one who you know will always counsel you wisely, pick one who will come to you first before she goes to others, and above all pick one who you trust with your life, because, should the worst ever happen to you, she will all but rule in your stead until your children are of age. Chapter 30, Justice. Chapter Text. Summary: Viserys, Shireen and Theon prove their worth. Notes: Character death. No interlude this time, as 10.6k words felt like enough. Translation: This is my friend, Shireen. My blood. By Sir Ixis Nuha Rakiros, Shireen. Nuha Noga. 299 AC Jon Snow. The head outside Oberyn Martell's tent was decaying at a rate faster than anything Jon had seen before. Although, it was unsurprising, given the heat of the summer sun and the position of the head outside the tent perfectly placed to get the light all day. Jon had watched, from his allocated chambers in Riverrun, as Oberyn had returned his horse dragging the severed head and spine of Tywin Lannister behind him, and then set about finding the perfect spot to pitch his tent and display the head. Even as Jon gazed upon it, two crows swooped down and began to peck at the remains of the man's spine from where it remained attached to the base of Tywin Lannister's neck by just a few tendons and bones. There was a sharp cracking noise and one of the crows flew off, bone in its mouth. The spine wobbled slightly and, for a moment, Jon thought this might be it, that the head and spine would finally be severed, but it remained locked together. The second crow tugged sharply for a few moments before it too managed to successfully extract a piece of bone shard and took off. They use it to fortify their nests. Lovely. Lord Tully is quite frustrated with your decision to not dispose of the head in a dignified manner, he remarked, turning to look at Oberyn as the man pushed the flap of his tent aside and came to stand next to him. I find that I care very little for what Lord Tully thinks, Oberyn replied. And that it makes things harder for me. An added benefit. He sighed but did not move. Together he and Oberyn looked at the rotting head of Tywin Lannister for a few moments. He grimaced as a bit of flesh came loose from the chin and dropped onto the floor, not because of the act itself, but because it forced his eyes toward what had once been the mouth of Tywin Lannister, which was forevermore lodged in a permanent, unheard, scream. Lady Olenna sent word. Your nephew has arrived in Highgarden, along with your daughter. So now you have a hostage to my behavior. I do not think I need it, do I? He replied sharply, eyes not turning from Tywin's remains. Will you ever speak to me of what you did? No. Did he suffer? Beyond measure. His eyes flicked to Oberyn and then back to the head. You are lucky that Lord Tyrell did not arrive whilst you were enacting your justice. It was not luck, Oberyn replied softly. I am not the only man in your army who longed to see Tywin Lannister suffer, whether it be from his actions in this war or the rebellion. He had many enemies. There was a beat of silence and then he said, Why are you here? Do you not usually have a council meeting now? That is why I am here, he said, turning away from the head and to look at the man stood next him. Oberyn stood taller than he had previously, although that was, perhaps, all in Jon's own head, as though the weight of the deaths of his sister and her children was finally gone from his shoulders. There was an air of calm to Oberyn as well, that Jon had not seen in the man before, as though the restlessness in him was finally quelled. Oberyn turned away from the head with a satisfied smile on his face and to look at Jon. What do you require me for? Does Lord Tyrell still complain about the location of his chambers? Or does Lord Tully still demand the conversations are held in his personal solar? Or perhaps it is your father who still passes judgment on to me? It is that I would have all the kingdoms sworn to me at the table when my allies and I discuss strategy. I do not think my presence is required. I require it. One of Oberyn's eyebrows rose. Well, if my king commands it. He snorted. Were I any other king, you would have sent someone else in your stead to summon me, and you would have missed the opportunity to admire my work. He grimaced. Will you come? Very well. They turned together and headed back toward the keep without another word. As they walked, he kept half an eye on Prince Oberyn. He knew that many of his bannermen and the lords thought that he gave the man too much rope, that he will surely hang you with, your grace, but there was something about Prince Oberyn that made Jon more reluctant to force his will on him. He was not naive enough to think that Oberyn was loyal to him, nor his friend. They would likely never be friends, and Oberyn had only given his support once Jon had promised he could have Tywin Lannister, but he did not think the man would turn traitor on him. Not now, at least. I would write to Lord Willers. The Maester has ravens you can use. You do not wish to read it before I send it. I am sure that if you wished to write something unseemly to Lord Willers, that he would alert someone to your intentions. Oh, I can assure you, it will be most unseemly. Have you thought any more on my offer? Oberyn was silent for a moment, eyes fixed ahead of him as they wended their way through the tents. He did not break his silence even as they crossed over the drawbridge and entered the courtyard of Riverrun. It was only when they began to climb the stairs that would take them to the Lord Tully's personal solar that Oberyn finally broke his silence. To me, King's Landing is one of the 7 hells. There is nothing that could make me return there once you have taken the crown. Then I would have the name of a man that you trust to advise me, he replied softly as the guards ahead of them bowed and pushed the solar door inwards. Dorne is part of the 7 kingdoms. I would see them represented. Until then, your presence at meetings is required. They crossed through the doors together and he hid a sigh as they entered as he caught sight of Lord Tully scowling at Oberyn. He knew many of the lords had no love for the Dornishman, for Oberyn was unapologetically unpredictable and seemed to delight in doing nothing more than upsetting, insulting or frustrating every man in Riverrun. The only people who seemed to like Oberyn, other than Garland Tyrell, were Robb, Oren and Viserys. He had watched several times as his brother and Prince Oberyn sparred together and laughed. On occasion, Viserys and Oren Waters would join Robb, Garland and Oberyn, and the 5 of them would spar together. It was interesting to Jon how 5 men who were so different and who had had such different lives could find such an easy friendship in each other. Yet not a day went by where the 5 men did not spend several hours in each other's company. He often, usually whilst he locked in another slightly tedious conversation with Lord Tyrell or Lord Tully, longed to join them, but he could not. He did not have that luxury. Not until the war was won, at least. But it did hearten him to see his brother find allies and friends to find his place in Jon's new life. He knew that Robb had not done it out of the kindness of his heart. For although his brother often gave off the impression of being young and naive, he was no fool. Robb knew what Viserys being in the encampment meant, and yet he had tried to build a friendship with Viserys and to include him rather than sideline him as others may have done, letting their fear at being replaced take over. And he was beyond grateful to Robb for keeping an eye on Viserys and Oberyn and Garland, and if his brother had found friendships over it, then Jon would never complain. They needed all the loyal allies they could, and there were few things more powerful than friendships won on the battlefield. He pulled himself back to the present and nodded to those gathered and took his place at the head of the huge table between his father and Viserys. Viserys nodded at him as their eyes met and then flicked his gaze to Oberyn with an unasked question. Jon shifted slightly on his feet and turned his gaze away, trusting that his uncle would understand this was a matter to be discussed later. Nearby, Lord Tully looked up at him from heavy eyes from where he was positioned, seated as always, near Robb, and inclined his head. He smiled shortly and jerked his head in response. "My thanks for your patience," he began, watching the men gathered carefully. "This will be our last meeting for some time. This morn we received word from Stannis Baratheon at Bronze Egget. He has been informed that the Iron Fleet sails for Dragonstone and calls for aid. We will not get there in time," Mace Tyrell said instantly. His gaze was fixed directly on Jon as he spoke. His eyes widened when their gazes met, and he turned his head away as a flush began to creep up his cheeks. "My apologies, Your Grace. But we cannot get there in time. We do not have the ships for the men, for one thing." There was a noise near the other end of the table, like someone smothering a snort. He ripped his eyes from Mace Tyrell to look at Oberyn and hid a sigh. Of course, Oberyn would believe that Mace Tyrell was being cowardly again, trying to wiggle out of doing any actual fighting. But, looking around the table, he could tell that Oberyn was not alone in his assessment. The Reach turning up after the battle had been won had not gone down well with many of the men. Loath though he was to agree with them, privately he could not help but think they were right about how slow the Reach armies had been. Still, he could not afford those thoughts now. He needed his army to be united, not squabbling like Arya and Sansa. You are right, Lord Tyrell, he said loudly, cutting across Lord Edmure as he made to open his mouth. Our men will not get there in time, which is why I shall be leaving as soon as this meeting is concluded. I will fly to Dragonstone. You cannot. Winter is not yet fully recovered from the battle. Her wounds still bleed, Robb said quickly, cutting across several other lords who had opened their mouths to speak. And you cannot take on the full might of the Iron Fleet alone. He turned to look at his brother, watching as, although Robb flushed in embarrassment, he still did not turn his gaze from Jon's. I have no choice, he replied. Lord Baratheon is my ally, and his daughter is on Dragonstone. And even if that were not the case, my aunt will be on Dragonstone shortly. Lord Stannis writes that Montfort Valerian asked his son and Daenerys to relocate to Dragonstone to try and keep them all safe. Why? They should have fled. One of the Riverlands lords interjected. What if it is a trap? He turned from Robb to look at Viserys, who had spoken. Then it is a trap. Prince Viserys is right, Great Jon said, standing straight, towering over every other man present and resting one hand on the pommel of his giant sword as he spoke. We cannot be sure this is not a trap. Lord Robb also speaks true. The battle was less than a week ago. Even to my eyes, your dragon looks tired, your grace. I do not wish to be the man to say it, but we cannot risk sending you to Dragonstone even if your aunt is there. Dragonstone is said to be impregnable. One of the Reach Lords, Jon, thought it might be Randil, Tarly said softly. It is why Queen R'hllor was sent there. We should trust that they will be safe. If Princess Daenerys has relocated there, she and Lady Shireen will be safe for now. For now. What sort of king am I if I do not answer a call for aid when it is received? A smart one, Robb muttered quietly, his voice only just discernible to Jon. I am going, he said sharply, his voice cutting through the mutterings around the table. Everyone around the table fell silent instantly. He turned his head, meeting their eyes and making it clear that he would not be moved. The army shall march south as soon as it is able. Head toward King's Landing. Lord Baratheon and I will join you there. If we are lucky, by the end of this year the war will be over. Near the end of the table, Lord Tyrell cleared his throat. I do not wish to be the one to say it, but should you fall, your grace. At the edge of the room, nearly hidden by the shadows from the thick curtains that hung on the window nearby, Oren Waters' head snapped away from where it had been fixed on the ceiling to rest of Jon. He met the man's eyes and then turned his head away, unable to look him in the face. I would speak to my uncle alone, he said. He paused and quickly grabbed a piece of parchment from the table in front of him, a quill, and wrote down a hastily note. Father, send this to Lord Baratheon, and then write to Lord Wyman, tell him to send the fleet to Dragonstone. Lord Tyrell, write to Lord Redwyne and tell him likewise. I believe Lord Baratheon has already asked for their aid, but they may not wish to sail without orders. Father took the offered note whilst Mace Tyrell puffed up slightly and bowed toward him. Then, the lords in the room began to leave. He watched them go, unable to look toward Viserys, who he knew was staring at him. Eventually, once Father had shut the door behind him with a sharp snap, he turned to his uncle. You will stay here, uncle. She is my sister. I know, he said quietly, infinitely glad it was just him and Viserys in the room. But Winter is not yet strong enough to take 2 grown men on her back and still fly at the speed we need her to. As much as I hate to admit it is true, Robb is right, she is not yet fully recovered. I cannot risk Daenerys nor you. Why do you risk it all for a man you have never met? Stannis Baratheon has not even bent the knee yet. You are not responsible for him nor his house. I made a promise to Lord Baratheon when I spoke to Sir Davos that I would see Lady Shireen safe even if he did not bend the knee. He has since offered his support. I cannot turn my back on him now. Viserys half froze, his mouth set in a firm line and his eyes fixed on Jon. And what else did you offer him? Men like Stannis Baratheon do not bend the knee simply because someone offers safety to their children. A match with you to Lady Shireen, he replied frankly. If you and he were amenable. I had planned to wed a daughter from your union to my son should I be blessed a child one day to reunite the Baratheon and Targaryen line on the Iron Throne. I also offered him a man of his choosing a place on my small council and asked that he advise me in the wars to come. He watched carefully as Viserys' nostrils flared and his uncle ground his teeth slightly. For half a moment he thought that this might be it, the moment that Viserys, finally, decided he could not support Jon, but then his uncle just heaved out a huge sigh, suddenly looking tired. It was interesting. So often over the last week, Jon had watched as Viserys seemed to fight himself on so many things. There had been moments where he had been sure that Viserys was going to strike him down with a sword, and then seconds before Jon had moved his hand toward his sword, Viserys seemed to calm down. He had half wondered if this was the Targaryen madness that he had heard men whisper of. But, looking at Viserys and knowing his uncle like he did now, having spent so much time together this last week and knowing all that had happened to him as a child, he could not believe it was madness. A sickness, perhaps. But not madness. "I will not force you into a match, uncle," he said softly. "If needs be, I will wed the Lady Shireen myself when she is of age. But it was my hope that Lord Baratheon would allow Dragonstone would pass to Lady Shireen and to you. By rights he should have Storm's End. I offered him that as well," he agreed. "But Dragonstone is closer for my hand, is it not?" When Viserys' face twitched slightly, he continued, "Storm's End is his by right. But whilst Renly lives, and Dragonstone sits empty, why not allow him to have it? He has ruled it well, by all accounts, these last 5 and 10 years. Besides, there are few men I can take as my hand. I cannot take Lord Stark, for he belongs in the north. I cannot take Lord Tyrell, for he is not suited. I cannot take Lord Edmure, for he is likewise not suited. I cannot take a Dornishman, for it must be someone who fought alongside us in this war. That leaves me with Lord Stannis or one of the Vale Lords. Of all of them, Lord Stannis knows the most of ruling, given his service on Robert Baratheon's small council. If I install him as my hand and you wed Lady Shireen, it will show those who believe House Targaryen to be mad and believe that we are all like my grandfather that we are not. It will show them that we are merciful, we honor our oaths, and we reward loyalty. And it would allow Lord Baratheon to be closer to his daughter." "You could have named me," Viserys murmured, his voice frigid, his eyes turned away from Jon and fixed on the window nearby as though he could not bear to look at Jon. "I would have served you." He regarded Viserys for a moment, watching as his uncle tried desperately to keep his face blank and resolutely refused to meet Jon's gaze. "I could," he agreed. "But would you truly wish to spend your life advising me? I have seen you in these meetings, uncle. You find no joy in the politics, or the realm, and you do not have the same thrill for it that you do when you are with Aerion. You are happier the more the days go by spending your time with Aerion and sparring with Robb and the others. Being a hand is a burden, not a reward. I would not have you suffer so out of a sense of pride or duty." When Viserys did not speak, he moved slightly closer to his uncle and carefully put a hand on his shoulder. Viserys flinched at the contact as he done all times previously when they had touched, but Jon pretended not to notice. "If you wish to be my hand, then I would gladly take you. I will always value your advice and your views, and, most importantly, I would trust you. But I do not think it is what you want nor what would make you happy." "I will not make a good husband," Viserys said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have said to me that you do not make a good brother either," he replied. "Yet you saved your sister's life. You defended her when Lord Tully tried to secure a match. I imagine you would also say that you do not make a good uncle." "I disagree. You speak too kindly of me." "I speak as I see," he said sharply. "You have done nothing to make me distrust you. That you have been honest about your mistakes and your past has only made me trust you more. I know little of Lady Shireen, but I do know that Sir Davos Seaworth was most concerned about her. Tell me, uncle, how does a child scarcely 10 name days earn the loyalty of such a man, a former smuggler? A child that was kind. One that treated him as an equal," Viserys replied immediately, his eyes snapping from the window to Jon. "One that was like Dany." He agreed. Viserys chewed on the inside of his mouth. Jon could see his uncle's lower jaw jutting out and hear the slight noise coming from within. There was a long silence before, eventually, Viserys jerked his head in a sharp nod. "What would you have me do until you return?" "Ride at the head of my armies. Ride with Father, Prince Oberyn, Lord Edmure and Lord Mace, and ride for King's Landing. I will send word once I arrive at Bronze Egget and join up with Lord Stannis. And should the worst happen, you have not named an heir. You ended the conversation just now before Lord Tyrell could ask you who you have named heir. I ended the conversation, uncle, because it is obvious who my heir is. Not to me, it is not. There was something in Viserys' tone that made Jon pause for a moment. For half a second he thought, perhaps, his uncle was trying to secure his place as heir, and then he instantly dismissed it. It was not longing in Viserys' voice, but concern, worry that the burden would fall to him. Instantly he felt guilt creep up on him that he could think, even for a moment, that his uncle still wished for the throne. If I should fall, he said eventually, if the worst should happen, then you are my heir. You must marry Lady Shireen if she lives, and, when the day comes for your sons to take a wife, you will find a match with House Stark and House Tyrell, a daughter of Margaery and Robb. Joe. No, uncle, he said softly. The lords of Westeros will never accept Daenerys on the throne. You know this. Should you refuse the throne and wed, and one day have a son, they will scramble to use him to take the throne from her. It will be war one way or